This girl had just swallowed a vial of poison, and it was her own brother who had thrown it at her. Before the poison took hold, she told him that she had already lived through the exact same life 7 times before, and this was her very last chance at rebirth. In her first 7 lives, she had believed she could become a true member of their family, so she had tried again and again. But now she was through with trying. For the first time, her eyes held a resolve she had never shown before. "Brother, I'll see you in the next life." Her vision blurred, and she collapsed into a pool of her own blood. This girl was called Navia, an orphan taken in by the Duke. But the Duke had once said that if his own daughter hadn't fallen ill with an incurable disease, he never would have adopted some nameless orphan to stand in for her and marry the prince. Her brother had told her outright, "I never liked you from the start. I won't let some filthy commoner like you drag our noble family down." What Navia wanted seemed simple enough, yet it was the hardest thing to get: a family. In her 7th life, she drank the poison her brother had thrown at her, watching the number on her wrist that marked her remaining rebirths drop from 1 to 0. This was her final life, and she vowed she would never again live for anyone else. Back in the present, Navia blinked. She had been reborn into her 8-year-old body again, her sharp, bright eyes lacking the innocence a child should have. She pulled back her sleeve. The number that had marked her rebirths was gone. Her small hand fell limp at her side. Navia's eyes were hollow. Every one of her past lives had ended in failure, so where exactly had she gone wrong? She murmured to herself that she had simply wanted too much, wanting to be like her brother and sister, to occasionally be doted on by their parents. She had believed that if she just tried hard enough, everything would eventually turn out fine. Navia lay in bed, quietly sobbing. It hurt so much. She just wanted so badly to be loved. Even though in her past lives she had done everything she could to become part of this family, all she'd ever gotten in return was mockery and scorn. Her tears fell one after another. After 7 rebirths, Navia felt a weariness unlike anything before. Her tears soaked into the pillow. She wished she could leave this world forever, leave this place that was steeped in sorrow. But that was nothing more than a wish. Sometime later, she pushed herself up from the bed, worn out from crying. Just then, the door slammed shut with a loud bang, followed by the click of a lock. Navia's expression turned cold. She knew it was her brother who had locked the door. He often locked her in her room, leaving her to go hungry. In her 4th life, trapped in her room like this, she had jumped from the balcony to avoid being late for class and died on the spot. Navia glanced coldly at the door. It was dead quiet outside. Her brother must have already left. She walked over to check whether the door was locked, and sure enough, it was. She let out a long sigh. Coming up here first thing in the morning just to torment her. How ridiculous. Navia searched carefully around the doorframe, and soon found a hole about the width of a finger. This was the hole her brother had drilled so he could drop insects into her room. Seeing it only confirmed what she already knew, that all her past efforts had been utterly meaningless. Standing on a chair, Navia struggled to pull down the lamp oil from the cabinet. She poured it through the hole, making it look as though the oil had been poured in from outside. Then she turned to the candlestick nearby. The burning flame caught the flammable oil, and fire spread through the room in an instant. She shoved open the balcony door. In this lifetime, she was finally clear-eyed. The one who would protect her wasn't some savior who would appear out of nowhere. It was herself. This was the heroine's 8th rebirth. After being reborn, she had set her own bedroom ablaze without hesitation. She needed a fire, one big enough to reduce her and the entire Duke's estate to ashes. For 7 lifetimes, she had worked tirelessly to please her family, and all she'd received was ridicule and mockery. It was only in this final life that she had made up her mind. Whoever dared cross her would pay the price. Navia stood on the balcony as smoke and ash swirled behind her. She screamed at the top of her lungs, "Help! Somebody help me!" The estate erupted into chaos. Servants rushed to her room to put out the fire while she calmly waited on the balcony for them to break the door down. In an instant, Navia's expression shifted, replaced by one of helpless, pitiful fear. She clenched her fists. "Please, save me." Her brother, hearing the commotion, came running over. Suddenly remembering his own playroom was right next door, he immediately barked orders at the servants to put out the fire. The Duke arrived at the sound of the chaos, his face cold and displeased. He demanded to know how the estate was being managed and why a fire had broken out so early in the morning. As he spoke, he raised his hand and released a water spell, extinguishing the flames. Navia knelt on the ground, coughing into her hands. Amid the confusion, the Duke glanced at her with indifference. She was the substitute he'd paid a fortune for, and there was no room for anything to go wrong now. The Duke noticed his son standing to the side and frowned in confusion. Why is he here? Surely he didn't come to save Navia. Just then, a guard discovered the hole in Navia's door and concluded that someone had poured oil through it and set it alight. The nanny, who had been comforting the boy, felt a jolt of alarm. She knew that hole had been drilled by the young master himself. The Duke's brow furrowed. He suspected this might be some scheme by a rival branch of the family, trying to get rid of Navia so their own child could be adopted into the estate instead. He noticed the nanny's uneasy expression. It seems you know something about this. The Duke's son turned away indifferently and simply admitted that he was the one who had drilled the hole. So what if I did? Navia stepped forward at just the right moment, saying weakly that she had begged her brother to let her out, but he had ignored her the whole time. Her words set the servants whispering among themselves. Could it be that the young master locked the young lady in? The Duke was furious. He turned and slapped his son across the face, berating him for treating his own sister this way. Yet beneath his anger, the Duke's mind was churning. He wasn't actually protecting Navia out of concern for her. He knew there were plenty of people outside just waiting for a chance to expose him. He had made a deal with the queen to marry Navia off to the prince once his real daughter came of age. If word got out now that Navia was a commoner, on top of rumors that they had mistreated their adopted daughter, it would spell serious trouble. He had no choice but to appear to defend her in front of everyone. The brother, still stinging from the slap, refused to back down. He admitted he had locked Navia in the room but insisted he hadn't started the fire. He glared at her furiously. She's nothing but filth. Why does father always take her side? He shouted, Say it yourself, did I start that fire? But all he got in return was Navia's steady, unyielding gaze. He had never seen her look so cold before, like a statue carved from ice, utterly devoid of feeling. The 10-year-old boy shivered from head to toe. He raised his fist to threaten her, if only to bolster his own nerve. Navia played along, covering her head and shrinking back into a trembling, timid pose. She knelt on the ground, trembling, and admitted, I was wrong. It wasn't my brother who started the fire. Her brother beamed with satisfaction, thinking that was exactly how it should be. The next moment, Navia pressed her forehead hard against the floor. Brother, please forgive me. Again and again, he calmly accepted his sister's apology. The servants watching from the side erupted in outrage. This has gone too far. This was the heroine's 8th rebirth, and this time, she no longer craved her family's love. Navia knelt before her brother, claiming she had been mistaken and that he hadn't started the fire. In truth, this was all part of her scheme. She had set her own room on fire, staging it to look like someone else had done it deliberately. Once her brother's anger flared, she immediately dropped to her knees and begged for his forgiveness. In the eyes of the estate's servants, all they saw was a domineering, arrogant brother and a weak, easily bullied sister. To keep the situation from spiraling further, the Duke quickly silenced the servants' murmuring, claiming Navia had been badly shaken by the fire and had the nanny look after her. Her brother was confined to the house as punishment. The nanny seemed to have heard something outrageous. Isn't that punishment a bit excessive? The young master is only 10 years old. The Duke angrily told her to be quiet. If the nanny had done her job properly and looked after both children, none of this would have happened. The Duke instructed the butler to have Navia moved up to the 3rd floor. Her brother's expression shifted, and he looked ready to argue further. But the Duke snapped at him to be silent. If you say one more word, the butler respectfully led the way, guiding Navia to her new quarters on the 3rd floor. Navia thought to herself that the 3rd floor was reserved for the Duke's true family, a place she had only reached because she had set fire to her room. What the Duke really meant was that she should be satisfied and not hold a grudge over what had happened today. Navia followed the butler out. Through the entire incident, the Duke had never once asked if she'd been hurt. Even though she had already given up hope of belonging here, she still felt a pang of disappointment. Arriving on the 3rd floor, Navia looked at a room far grander than her old one. She recalled how desperately she had once longed to live here, but now it felt like nothing special at all. She studied her thin reflection in the mirror. Ever since the day she was adopted, she had been warned never to gain weight, and her meals had been strictly controlled. When good food became a reward instead of a right, Someone left hungry could be controlled completely. Navia had a head of silver hair and a pair of red eyes. It was almost hard to believe. What was ironic was that she used to despise this appearance so different from the Duke's own family. She couldn't understand now why she'd ever felt that way. She coughed softly a few times. After all the commotion this morning, it seemed she'd caught a bit of a fever. She hugged herself, trembling, but remembering how many plans she still had to carry out, Navia clenched her jaw. Now was not the time to be sick. She went over the events of her past lives in her mind. Each rebirth shared one thing in common. She always died within a year of her sister, the Duke's biological daughter, being cured of her illness. Though the magic reflux disease was currently incurable, a cure would eventually be discovered 12 years from now. In her previous life, she had lived to the age of 20, but even after 12 years, she had never truly become part of this family, and in the end she still died from her brother's poison. This was the heroine's 8th rebirth. In her first 7 lives, she had fought desperately to earn her family's love. Now, she was determined to escape this place. Navia calculated that to leave the Duke's estate, she needed to accomplish 2 things. First, cure her sister's magic reflux disease, and second, find a new family willing to adopt her. She already knew the cure from her memories of past lives. As for a new guardian, she already had someone in mind, the 30-year-old unmarried Duke Reed, who had no heir yet. Before long, the second prince would become his adopted son. In her previous life, Navia had lived to 20 for the first time, and witnessed the second prince's rise within the Reed family. He was flawless in every way, appearance and ability alike. By her calculations, the second prince was still a year younger than her current age, which meant he wouldn't be sent to Duke Reed's estate for another year. In other words, the position of heir would remain vacant for that entire year. A knock at the door interrupted Navia's thoughts. A maid had brought her something to eat. Just then, the nanny's voice rang out from behind the maid. "Lady Navia!" The nanny strode into the room, shoving the maid out of her way, and declared self-righteously, "You will go and kneel before the Duke this instant and beg his forgiveness." Navia knew exactly what this was about. The nanny was speaking up for her brother. He'd only been confined to the house, and yet the nanny was already so upset on his behalf when Navia herself had nearly burned to death. Still, she was long used to this kind of double standard. Navia ignored the nanny entirely, and instead had the maid bring over her food. She glanced at the bowl of food so unappetizing even a dog would turn its nose up at it. She'd grown accustomed to it by now, but she had no intention of putting up with it any longer. Seeing that Navia was ignoring her, the nanny raised her voice. "Are you ignoring what I'm saying?" Navia rose to her feet and walked toward her, her tone utterly cold. "I'm not sure which matter you think I need to beg my father's forgiveness for." The nanny looked down at Navia with contempt. "For the young master being punished, of course. How could you let the heir to this family suffer such an unjust accusation?" After hearing this, Navia's smile carried a hint of something knowing. Ignored once again, the nanny's anger flared. She grabbed Navia's wrist, intending to teach her a lesson. Navia, unhurried, said she now understood exactly where she'd gone wrong, that only now had she realized her allowance had been embezzled by the nanny all along. The nanny denied it in a panic. "What are you talking about?" Navia knew perfectly well from her past lives that the nanny was always caught embezzling her allowance and executed by the Duke's order, which was why she'd been left eating such poor meals. The nanny clenched her fists, shocked and unsettled, unable to understand how Navia could possibly know this. But no matter what, she couldn't let this get out. She insisted she was completely loyal to the estate, and warned Navia that if she kept spreading such nonsense, she might just lose her tongue. Navia looked the nanny straight in the eye. "I wonder what my father would think, if he ever saw what I'm served every day." This heroine had been brainwashed by a mage and had lived through 8 rebirths, all in pursuit of her family's love. In her first 7 lives, she had eaten this same food that even a dog would refuse. This time, wide awake to the truth, Navia had no intention of repeating that mistake. She knew the nanny had embezzled her allowance, and that the nanny had known about the hole her brother drilled in the door all along, yet never bothered to fix it. Navia said deliberately and evenly, "My father hates nothing more than impropriety. If he learned that a servant had betrayed him like this, how devastated he'd be." The nanny felt a chill run through her. Yet she still refused to admit her guilt, arguing loudly in her own defense. Navia said no more. She turned to go find the Duke, intending to kneel before him and tell him everything. The nanny, unable to hold back any longer, reached out to grab her, but Navia was too frail and fell straight to the floor. At that very moment, the doctor pushed open the door. Arriving to examine Navia, only to be shocked by what he saw, the nanny had actually shoved the young lady to the ground. A maid rushed over in a panic to check on her. The nanny's heart sank. She had been so focused on confronting Navia that she'd completely forgotten there was a maid in the room. Had she just heard everything about the embezzled allowance? Navia sat on the floor, sobbing softly. Even if you don't want me living on the 3rd floor, you didn't have to do this to me. Hearing Navia twist the story against her, the nanny felt both alarmed and furious. The doctor scoffed coldly and demanded to know if she had a problem with the Duke's orders. The nanny tried to argue, but the doctor had seen with his own eyes how she'd shoved the young lady to the ground, and harming a noble was a serious crime. He had no interest in hearing her excuses, and ordered her to leave the room at once. The nanny didn't know what to do. If the Duke found out about what happened today, her embezzlement would surely come to light as well, and she truly would lose her head. Navia stood up, her face full of sincerity, and said she wouldn't tell her father, telling the nanny not to worry about it. Hearing this, the nanny didn't feel relieved at all. She had no idea what game Navia was playing, but seeing her tilt her head with such an innocent, dazed look, she gradually let her guard down, thinking she was just a child after all. She decided she would prepare some more generous meals for a while to keep Navia quiet, and use the time to destroy the evidence of her embezzlement. But what to do about the maid who had witnessed everything, she had no idea. Just then, the doctor spoke up again, telling the nanny to leave immediately. She stormed out, her face dark with anger. After the nanny left, Navia sat on the bed while the doctor examined her. She looked at the maid, Charlotte, standing by the bedside and thought quietly to herself. After the nanny was executed for embezzlement in her past lives, Charlotte would take over her position and eventually start embezzling too. This time, that hadn't happened yet. Charlotte outwardly obeyed the nanny, but had secretly been winning over servants who were on bad terms with her. Navia planned to make good use of that. After a while, the doctor finished his examination and prepared to leave. Navia grabbed at his sleeve, looking utterly pitiful, and begged him not to tell anyone what had happened today, because she didn't want to see the nanny punished by the Duke. The doctor sighed helplessly, thinking Navia was so foolish. No wonder the servants took advantage of her. After the doctor left, Charlotte, who had been standing to the side, bowed and turned to leave as well. Navia dropped the fragile act at once, a confident smile spreading across her face. "Did you really think I'd let you go that easily?" Navia confronted the nanny directly about embezzling her allowance, determined never to let herself be bullied again. Charlotte, who had overheard the entire exchange, was asked to stay behind and nervously asked what her lady needed of her. Navia knew exactly what Charlotte wanted: the dirty money the nanny had stolen, and Navia could help her get it. In this life, if she wanted to escape, she needed someone she could rely on, and that person was Charlotte. Navia said quietly without looking up that she had no intention of exposing the nanny's crime. Charlotte asked why, sensing for the first time that the young lady in front of her had become someone entirely different from before. Navia continued, "Besides me, you're the only other person who knows the nanny embezzled the allowance. So do you think she'd rather deal with me, who's already agreed not to say anything, or deal with you first?" Charlotte lowered her head, not daring to meet Navia's eyes, still not quite understanding what she meant. A glint of cunning crossed Navia's eyes as she told Charlotte to abandon any thought of reporting the nanny to the Duke. Exposing her could get rid of the nanny, sure, but the Duke would certainly wonder how Charlotte had come to know such a thing, and there was no telling whether the suspicious Duke might decide the two of them were in on it together. Charlotte finally understood. If her lady didn't report the nanny, there was no way for her to walk away clean either. Now that she knew about the crime, the nanny wouldn't let her go unpunished. Navia said calmly, "But we can't just let the nanny off the hook either, don't you agree?" She stated her intentions plainly. "I simply want to use you. If you choose to help me, you'll get everything the nanny has taken for herself." Cold sweat ran down Charlotte's back. She truly had no other choice. And in that moment, she felt the full weight of Navia's hostility toward this family. Navia made no attempt to hide it, murmuring to herself that she knew she would never truly become the Duke's daughter. So it was time to draw a clean line between herself and everyone here. Someone of such low birth brought in as an adopted daughter, how could she ever hope for a good life here? That's everything. So, what will you do? Navia asked, waiting for Charlotte's final decision. Charlotte lowered her head in thought. Choosing sides was dangerous, but she had never seen this kind of composure in either the young master or the young lady of this family the way she saw it now in Navia. Thinking back on everything that had happened today, she realized the fire on the second floor could not have been an accident. With that thought, Charlotte bowed her head. I'm willing to follow your instructions. Navia smiled brilliantly. Then I'll be counting on you from now on. She then laid out her plan. Her allowance had been embezzled through collusion between the nanny and the head chef. Charlotte would need to drive a wedge between the two of them, letting the nanny know she was working for Navia. That way, the nanny would assume Navia, Charlotte, and the chef were all in league together. And since the chef held evidence of their shared embezzlement, the nanny wouldn't dare destroy it to save herself. With that settled, Navia sent Charlotte away. She was truly exhausted. Everything that had happened today had worn her frail body down completely, and all she wanted now was to lie down and rest for a while. Navia curled up into a small, pitiful ball, quietly encouraging herself. I did well. I won't let anyone bully me again. In her 8th rebirth, the heroine, determined to escape the Duke's estate, had first neutralized the nanny, and then brought the maid under her control. Exhausted, she lay down to rest, but soon slipped into a pitch-black dream. Navia looked around, but there was nothing to see except deep, impenetrable darkness. Without thinking, she looked up, only to witness something terrifying, a massive, blood-red eye hanging in the air, staring fixedly at her. Navia trembled all over in fear, unable to understand why such an eye would be watching her. A chill ran through her entire body, and she hugged herself tightly, not daring to look up again. Under that overwhelming gaze, she felt as though she were about to be swallowed whole. Just then, a stream of purple magical energy burst from the wrist of her right hand, and searing pain flooded her senses. The magical current coiled around her wrist, and her wrist began to glow. Pure white moonlight broke through the endless darkness as a crescent moon rose high above. Navia felt thoughtful. She sensed that this crescent moon was somehow protecting her, and the pain in her wrist faded away. She slowly pulled back her sleeve. Where the number marking her rebirths used to be, a faint, blurry shadow now appeared. She furrowed her brow, lost in thought. Back in reality, Navia bolted upright, looking around at the unfamiliar surroundings, unable to place where she was for a moment. Her heart pounded wildly, the menace of that giant eye still lingering in her mind. She forced herself to calm down and touched her forehead, relieved to find her fever had finally broken. Then she noticed something new on her wrist, a mark shaped like a black moon, identical to the crescent moon that had protected her from being consumed in her dream. The number that had once marked her rebirths was gone entirely. Encountering such an unexpected change in her final life caught Navia completely off guard. A short while later, Charlotte brought in the day's meal and noticed that the food from the night before hadn't been touched at all. She asked with obvious concern how her lady was feeling. Navia felt a flicker of surprise. Charlotte was actually worried about her. In the year and more since she'd been brought to this estate, no one had ever asked how she was doing before. Ever since the two of them had formed their alliance, Charlotte seemed to have grown noticeably more considerate. Eating a rare plate of fresh vegetables and fruit, Navia couldn't help but remark that this finally felt like a proper meal. As she listened to Charlotte's report on how the plan was progressing, she wanted to confirm whether she was the only one who could see the black moon on her wrist. Navia pointed to her wrist and remarked that her sleeve seemed to have gotten shorter. Charlotte suggested that perhaps the young lady had simply grown taller. Navia brought her wrist closer and asked if she meant she'd touched near her wrist. Charlotte clarified she meant the back of her hand would be a better spot, otherwise the sleeve would soon be too short again. After a bit of careful testing, Navia confirmed that she was indeed the only one who could see the black moon, though she still had no idea what purpose it served. After finishing her meal, it was time for her lessons. On her way to the classroom, Navia thought to herself that in order to escape the Duke's estate, she first needed to cure her sister's magic reflux disease. In her past lives, it was her tutor who had cured it, a man who, despite his youth, had already become a professor at the Imperial Academy and a powerful mind mage. As she reached the classroom door, she recalled something her tutor had once said to her, just before one of her deaths in a previous life. "Since you're about to die anyway, I suppose I can tell you. You've already been brainwashed by me, and you will remain loyal to this family forever. This heroine had been reborn 8 times, all in pursuit of her family's love. And this mindless devotion of hers turned out to be the result of brainwashing by her own tutor. He was a professor at the Imperial Academy who had never wanted to tutor Navia in the first place. But the Duke had hired him specifically because he could use mind control magic. He had used that magic to control Navia's mind, planting the suggestion that she remain absolutely loyal to the Duke's family. Through 7 rebirths, despite being tormented and battered by the people of this household, Navia had devoted herself to them without a single complaint or regret. Even the tutor himself had felt that using such magic on a child was going too far, but his own sister also suffered from magic reflux disease. This disease only affected children born to mage couples, and its victims would suddenly die from a total loss of magic power sometime before reaching adulthood. In his desperate effort to cure his sister, the tutor had studied relentlessly and achieved remarkable success, but he still lacked sufficient research subjects. With the Duke's support, he believed he could finally find a cure. Just then, the classroom door opened, and Navia lifted the hem of her skirt to perform a perfect noble's curtsy for her tutor. He stood there in silence. Her curtsy was graceful and humble, every movement flawless, utterly unlike the girl he'd seen yesterday. He let her in to begin the lesson, all the while thinking to himself, could everything he'd seen of her before have been an act? The tutor began the lesson, asking Navia if she still remembered what he'd taught about the 3 great ducal houses. Navia sat in her chair and spoke fluently, explaining that the 3 families were the House of Water and the House of Reed, associated with the law. The Reed family's connection to the law came from being the first to harness magical laws to build a new civilization, though sadly, under Duke Reed's leadership, the family had gradually declined. The tutor was utterly stunned by how detailed her knowledge was, assuming she must have studied ahead on her own. But Navia wasn't finished. She revealed that there had once been a 4th family in history, one skilled in mind control magic, that had stood alongside the other 3 as one of the 4 great ducal houses. The tutor grew tense, crossing his arms and gripping his sleeves tightly as he cut her off. What exactly are you trying to say? Are you testing me to see how well you've studied? Navia smiled easily, entirely at ease. What she meant was that he had nothing left to teach her. With that, she picked up her pen and began writing rapidly across the paper. The tutor looked at what she'd written and was astonished to find it was a complete imperial chronology, the handwriting itself carrying the flair of a master calligrapher. Navia looked up with confidence. Continuing these lessons would just be a waste of my time, don't you think? The tutor asked if she had hired another tutor behind his back. Navia said no. She had simply heard these lessons so many times across her past lives that she was thoroughly sick of them, and the paper she'd used practicing her handwriting could probably fill an entire library by now. She laid it out plainly. You've known all along that I'm the Duke's adopted daughter, haven't you? The tutor immediately tensed. Navia's attitude had shifted dramatically today, and he wondered whether his brainwashing was starting to fail. It seemed he needed to reinforce the spell's strength. He began channeling his magic, moving to invade her mind. My lady, let's just pretend I never heard any of this. And please, don't say such things again. The next moment, Navia said plainly, Teacher, I know the cure for magic reflux disease. The heroine, brainwashed by her family tutor, had lived through 8 rebirths chasing her family's love. This time she had broken free of his control and instead found a way to hold power over him. Navia told her tutor she knew the cure for magic reflux disease. He was utterly shocked, leaning in close and demanding to know exactly what the cure was. He had been teaching at the Duke's estate and knew the Duke's daughter suffered from the same illness, yet he'd never heard any news of her recovery. Navia clenched her fists with quiet confidence. Besides me, no one else knows the cure. The tutor felt as though he were being toyed with. His sister also suffered from magic reflux disease and her life hung in the balance. And here Navia was, daring to joke about something so serious. But on second thought, how had she even learned that he was searching for a cure in the first place? Surely the Duke hadn't told her. Looking at Navia's confident expression, the tutor couldn't begin to guess what was going on in this little girl's mind. He could use mind control magic, understanding a person's desires and needs in order to seize control of their thoughts. That was why, throughout the year he'd spent tutoring Navia, he had brainwashed her daily, cultivating in her an endless yearning for her family's love, keeping her forever loyal to the Duke. If the effect of the brainwashing ever weakened, all he needed to do was cast the spell again to regain control of her mind. With that thought, he channeled his magic once more, attempting to invade her mind. Yet Navia sat there completely relaxed, entirely unaffected by his magic. The tutor couldn't detect even a trace of desire or need from her mind at all. Navia gave him a sweet smile. "It seems you're having some trouble." The tutor stopped trying to hide it. Everything today had gone completely against his expectations, so he asked her directly what she was after. Navia laughed softly. "You should be asking what you can do for me." The tutor clenched his fists. Everything he'd done had been for his sister's sake, and if Navia truly knew the cure for magic reflux disease, he would trade his own life for it without hesitation. Having lived through 8 rebirths, Navia certainly wasn't about to take the tutor's word on faith. She knew he was a mage, so she demanded that he sign a mage's contract with her. Watching the man fall deep into thought, Navia continued, "I can tell you the cure, but you have to agree to 3 conditions. First, within the next 5 days, aside from your sister, you cannot treat anyone else, nor reveal the cure to a single soul." This confirmed for the tutor that Navia truly did know about his sister's illness. Second, 5 days from now, you will tell the Duke that you discovered the cure for magic reflux disease yourself. Third, you will convince the Duke to send me to the Reed family to become Duke Reed's heir. The tutor was confused. The Reed family had already fallen into ruin, nothing more than a wasteland now. Staying here would give her a far better chance of finding a suitable match for marriage. Navia walked over to the window, her tone tinged with melancholy, admitting the tutor had a point. She turned back around, her bright smile returning. "But that's not something you need to worry about." The tutor finally understood that Navia had already thought everything through. Though he'd been thoroughly outmaneuvered by her today, he wasn't angry. He actually felt a flicker of anticipation. He agreed to sign the mage's contract with her. This poor girl had lived through 8 rebirths, endlessly manipulated by her own tutor's brainwashing into chasing her family's love. During her 6th rebirth, the Duke had planned to sell her off to a barbarian king. Believing that the bond between teacher and student might move him to help her, she had knelt and begged for his mercy. His response had been, "That is precisely your value." Navia understood then it was her own tutor who had pushed her into that fire. His mind control magic worked especially well on a child conditioned from birth to feel inferior. To resist his influence, Navia had burned through 6 lifetimes. Only after that could she finally act on her own free will. In her previous life, she had been able to act entirely according to her own judgment, which was why she had lived to the age of 20, longer than all her previous lives combined, though in the end she still died from her brother's poison. In this final life, Navia no longer held out any hope for her family. Love, family, all of it was nothing but an illusion. She walked out of the classroom, head lowered, when her brother's voice suddenly rang out behind her. "Filth!" The Duke had made a rule that no one was allowed inside during Navia's lessons, but that rule held no weight over his own biological son. Her brother smirked. Having only been confined to the house 2 days ago, he clearly wasn't done causing trouble yet. Navia sighed and asked if he was planning to kill her. He stammered, startled. "Who said anything about killing you?" Navia remained utterly calm. "If you're not here to kill me, then why are you lurking around like some kind of rat?" It's rather amusing. Her brother's brow furrowed, clearly displeased by her attitude. He instinctively raised his fist, ready to threaten her the way he always had. Navia's expression didn't so much as flicker. Even though her brother would eventually grow into someone capable of killing without hesitation, right now he was still just a 10-year-old child. So she told him to go ahead and kill her if he had it in him. Faced with a Navia so unlike her usual self, her brother hesitated, unsure what to do. Seeing him falter, Navia had no interest in arguing further and turned to walk away. He called after her, still trying to save face. "Careful, I really might kill you." The next instant, Navia grabbed his wrist and yanked it hard toward her own throat. "Then hurry up and do it." Her brother, startled by her sudden intensity, jerked his hand back in a panic, releasing a burst of water magic reflexively. In an instant, Navia was engulfed in a thick column of water, her body completely losing control. Her brother laughed from below, having been cruel since childhood, feeling not the slightest bit of guilt, and even thinking she deserved it. Drowning and unable to breathe, Navia felt exactly the same as she had the first time she'd been reborn, when she had drowned in that lake. Could that have been her brother's doing too, all along? Watching him laugh so freely below her, Navia was consumed with hatred. Why did such vile people get to wield such tremendous power? Feeling her breath grow increasingly ragged, her body nearing its limit, something in Navia finally snapped. She couldn't die like this. Streams of magical energy burst from her wrist, the black moon mark absorbing her brother's water magic like a black hole. And in an instant, the thick column of water vanished entirely. Navia dropped to the ground, coughing violently. Her brother stood frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened before his eyes. Navia, meanwhile, was consumed with fury. A thought surfaced in her mind. She could now use her brother's own magic to strike back, meaning she could wield the power the black moon had absorbed. With that, she staggered to her feet and walked straight toward him. "Brother, have you ever heard of fighting fire with fire?" After being reborn, the heroine found herself bullied by her brother once again, but this time, she chose to fight back with equal force. Navia could now use the magic the black moon had absorbed. Powerful energy coiled around her wrist as a mass of water droplets gathered, and she smiled brilliantly. In the next instant, the water surged toward her brother, instantly trapping him within a column of water. Their roles reversed, Navia teased him, asking how it felt to be trapped in the very water column he'd created. Watching her brother struggle, unable to even speak, Navia understood clearly that she wasn't a mage herself and couldn't sustain the magic indefinitely. She could only maintain the water column using the power she'd absorbed, so he likely wouldn't drown outright. But now that she'd already made her move against him, she needed to make the most of it. Navia immediately cried out for help. "Is anyone there? My brother is trapped in the water." Meanwhile, the Duke was reading a letter from the Queen, who expressed interest in Navia, soon to marry the prince. The Duke understood this meant the Queen had grown suspicious of her background, though he had already fabricated a flawless identity for her. Just then, the tutor arrived to report on Navia's academic progress, asking the Duke directly, "Did something upset Navia yesterday? It seems the effect of the brainwashing has weakened." In truth, Navia herself had asked the tutor to tell the Duke this, so that whatever she did going forward wouldn't implicate him. The Duke wasn't surprised to hear this. Knowing Navia had just been through a fire the day before, he asked the tutor how best to handle it. The Duke was feeling particularly on edge these days. It was a sensitive time, with the Queen suspicious of Navia's background, and his son constantly causing trouble on top of it. The tutor assured him this wasn't a difficult problem, that as long as Navia's mental state remained stable, he could continue the brainwashing without issue. Hearing this, the Duke sipped his tea with some dissatisfaction. Even after moving Navia to the third floor following the fire, her emotions still hadn't stabilized. Still, controlling someone so lowly wasn't difficult. A few pieces of clothing and jewelry would be enough to placate her. Just then, the door burst open and a servant rushed in shouting, "Trouble! The young master is trapped in a column of water." The Duke rushed to the classroom door in a hurry, finding his son kneeling on the ground, soaked head to toe and coughing. He demanded to know from the servants why anyone had been allowed inside during Navia's lesson hours, despite his earlier orders. The servants stammered, unable to answer, until a maid stepped forward to explain that the young lady had said her brother summoned a water column and accidentally trapped himself in it. The Duke glanced at Navia, kneeling on the ground. Given the timing, with both of them soaked from head to toe, he didn't need to ask to know his son had gone looking for trouble with Navia again. The tutor had just told him to keep her emotionally stable, and now this had happened. Worried that the brainwashing might have failed, the Duke crouched down and asked Navia what had happened. Having lived through several rebirths, Navia was certainly not naive enough to think the Duke's concern for her was genuine. His own son had ended up like this, and yet his first instinct was to test her loyalty first, which she found utterly disgusting. Still, she played along, explaining to the Duke that she had been pestering her brother to show her some magic, and that was how the accident happened. Hearing this, the Duke smiled with satisfaction, listening to Navia's clumsy lie shielding her brother, confirming that the brainwashing hadn't fully worn off yet. This Duke was truly cold-hearted. Knowing his adopted daughter had been bullied by his own son, his very first concern was whether the mental conditioning on her was still holding. Navia dutifully claimed the whole thing was her own fault, since this entire performance was staged for the Duke's benefit. She walked over to her brother, pretending to help him up, but he was seething with rage. first bested by her magic and now watching her put on this pathetic act when it was clearly she who had done this to him. Furious, he shoved Navia to the ground and raised his fist to strike, only for the Duke to grab his wrist. Her brother, nearly hysterical with rage, shouted, "This filthy girl just tried to kill me! She stole my magic and used it against me!" These words immediately caught the Duke's attention. Stole your magic? Could Navia be a copy mage? In the world of magic, every mage possessed a specific innate ability, one that had a certain chance of being passed down to their children, much like his own family's water magic. A copy mage, however, could replicate any type of magic, an extremely rare and coveted talent among mages. The Duke walked over to Navia and reached out to check her magical affinity. If Navia truly were a copy mage, he certainly couldn't afford to marry off such a prize into the royal family. The result left the Duke disappointed. Aside from the magic belonging to himself and his son, there was no trace of any other magical fluctuation present. Navia offered a timely explanation, claiming she had seen a burst of blue light when her brother released his magic, and that was when he ended up wrapped in water. The Duke sighed, rubbing his temples. This was clearly a case of magic spiraling out of control, and given what he knew of his son, it wasn't the least bit surprising. Her brother tried to argue that he hadn't lost control, but the Duke told him to be quiet, remembering the tutor's advice about keeping Navia emotionally stable. He bent down, his tone noticeably gentler now, saying it was his own failure to properly discipline his son, and told Navia to go rest. He promised he would deal with her brother accordingly. Navia turned to leave, but her brother continued shouting after her, "Why does no one believe me?" Navia found it almost funny that something this small could send him into such a rage. Her brother really was fragile, and the chaos in this household had only just begun. Walking back from the classroom to her quarters on the 3rd floor, Navia kept thinking about the Black Moon. Her steps light, her bearing graceful, every bit the true noble lady, drawing whispers of admiration from the maids around her. Navia paid it no mind. She knew that to escape this place, she needed to keep the Duke satisfied, at least enough to guarantee her own safety for the time being. Just then, a bright, cheerful voice called out from behind her. "Sister, what are you doing here? Isn't this the 3rd floor?" This was the Duke's biological daughter, pampered and spoiled, yet also willful and unruly. Seeing Navia on the 3rd floor, she asked curiously why she was there. The maids around her let out a chorus of snide giggles, which irritated Navia greatly. She walked up to her sister and explained that the maids had laughed so loudly she couldn't hear what was being said. Her sister innocently repeated her question, assuming Navia had come up to visit her. Navia told her that their father had had her move to the 3rd floor to live there now. Delighted, her sister threw herself into Navia's arms, exclaiming that now they could play together every day. Navia had just been attacked by her brother's water magic and was still soaked from head to toe. Her sister recoiled in disgust at the dampness on her own hands. Navia, standing there, showed no reaction at all. Charlotte, unable to bear it any longer, asked how the young lady could speak to her that way. Navia stopped Charlotte, understanding clearly that this wasn't the moment for a direct confrontation. Her sister was the true daughter of this house, and no matter what she did wrong, she would always be forgiven, while Navia herself was nothing more than a stand-in. In her past lives, her sister had always pushed off the tasks she didn't want to do onto Navia, being the sort of naive, simple-minded person she was. And under her tutor's brainwashing, Navia had constantly striven to be the doting older sister her sibling deserved, especially given her illness, tolerating her endlessly, time and time again. Yet every single time, once her sister was cured, Navia would end up dead. In every one of her past lives, without exception, she died within a year of her sister's recovery. Still, Navia held no resentment toward her sister now. She had simply decided she would no longer exhaust herself trying to please this family, and that included no longer indulging her sister either. Back in reality, the dismissed Navia broke into a smile, claiming she had just been playing in the water with her brother and had accidentally gotten her clothes wet. Hearing this, her sister complained angrily that they had played in the water without inviting her, insisting it was terribly unfair. Navia comforted her gently. "You shouldn't play in water anyway, you'll catch a cold." A maid beside them muttered under her breath that Navia was hopeless, unable to even lie convincingly. Her sister was already on the verge of tears, and hearing Navia's words only made her more determined to go play in the water with their brother. Navia continued, "Brother's very busy right now, he doesn't have time to play with you." Her sister burst into tears, insisting she didn't care about anything else. She wanted to go find her brother to play in the water right this instant, and turned to run off toward the classroom. Her sister's maid shot Navia a venomous glare. Navia and Charlotte remained standing there. Charlotte was furious at how disrespectfully her sister's maid had treated her. Navia found it of little concern. She had already been looked down upon for so long that this level of treatment barely registered anymore. She turned to head back to her room, and before leaving, instructed Charlotte to prepare some cold tea and pumpkin porridge in the kitchen, then deliver it directly to the Duke. In her final rebirth, Navia had begun sowing chaos throughout the Duke's estate. Provoked by her, the sister rushed off eagerly to play in the water with their brother, who was still under the servant's watch, shouting and raving that he would kill that lowly girl. The Duke rubbed his temples with a sigh. His son really was too much like himself at that age. But as the heir to this estate, such behavior was simply unacceptable. Just then, the sister finally arrived at the classroom, clutching her small fists, asking pitifully why no one had invited her, since she'd heard her brother and sister Navia had played in the water together without her. The Duke crouched down to explain to her. They weren't playing in the water. Go on back now. Her brother snapped from behind him. Do you want to die? Get out of here! The sister froze, thinking she'd just heard her brother tell her to go die, and burst into tears on the spot. The Duke's brow furrowed, his gaze turning icy. How could you speak to your sister that way? Her brother argued indignantly that she had mocked him first. The Duke scooped up his sobbing daughter to comfort her, insisting she was only 6 years old. There was no way she would have mocked him. Her brother clenched his fists in anger. First their father had defended Navia, and now he was cradling his sister in his arms, as if everything, from start to finish, was somehow directed at him alone. The Duke's expression turned cold. Utterly disappointed in his son's behavior, he threatened to cut off his allowance entirely if he kept up this nonsense, and to cancel all his upcoming social engagements. Punished once again, her brother finally calmed down. He lowered his head and admitted his fault, though in his heart he placed all the blame squarely on Navia. Meanwhile, Navia made her way alone to the Duke's estate library. The Duke possessed an enormous fortune, but beyond his wealth, this family had virtually nothing else to speak of. The family's magic was a powerful water-based ability, but one that was extremely difficult to develop further. That was why the Duke had built a vast library within the estate, though no one but Navia ever set foot inside it. Navia had come hoping to find something about the origins of the Black Moon on her wrist, though she'd already gone through every book here in her past lives, and truly recalled nothing useful. She'd been soaked earlier and hadn't gotten proper rest these past couple of days. She sneezed. A cup of hot water would have been wonderful right about now. In his own chambers, the Duke let out a long sigh as he reclined on the sofa, thoroughly worn out by one troublesome incident after another these past 2 days. Just then, a soft knock came at the door. Lady Navia asked me to bring you some refreshments. The butler, standing inside, replied that the Duke was preparing to rest and told her to come back later, but the Duke cut him off. Let her in. He asked the maid to confirm whether it was Navia herself who had sent her, and Charlotte answered yes. She set down the freshly made pumpkin porridge and iced flower tea in front of the Duke, who eyed the food with some hesitation. The butler, clearly displeased, thought it was outrageous that Navia would send the Duke such a modest, unremarkable meal, and prepared to have the porridge removed to arrange something more suitable. Surprisingly, the Duke refused. He picked up a spoon and took a taste. And to his genuine surprise, this simple bowl of porridge suited his palate remarkably well. He took another spoonful, finding it even better than the elaborately prepared desserts from his head chef. Lifting the cup of iced flower tea, he asked the maid again to confirm it was truly Navia who had asked her to prepare this. Upon receiving confirmation, the Duke smiled. His own biological daughter never showed him any concern, and his son only ever caused trouble. Yet here was his adopted daughter, showing him such thoughtful care. How ironic. He set down his teacup and said slowly, "It seems Navia hasn't had new clothes or jewelry in quite some time. Have someone from the Anthill boutique send some clothes over for her?" Both the butler and Charlotte were stunned. The Anthill boutique? As his adopted daughter, Navia had sent him refreshments at the very moment he was most troubled, standing in stark contrast to his own children, who only ever brought him grief. The Duke decided to have some clothes and jewelry arranged for her from the Anthill boutique. Charlotte happily relayed the news to Navia. Marveling at how she could possibly have known the Duke enjoyed pumpkin porridge of all things, information Navia had only gathered through 7 lifetimes of hard-won experience. The Anthill boutique was so exclusive that even nobles with advance reservations sometimes couldn't get an order filled. Yet the Duke's order arrived within 2 days. Charlotte was already imagining how beautiful Navia would look in the new clothes. Navia smiled as well, pleased that her gesture had genuinely moved the Duke. She had never once received anything from the Anthill boutique before, since it was her sister's exclusive shop. She recalled how, in past lives, her sister used to flaunt her beautiful outfits in front of her, the only person in the entire social circle who could own the latest pieces from Anthill. Navia could only smile awkwardly and compliment the clothes, though in truth, she had longed to wear such beautiful things herself. Her sister, meanwhile, would recommend she shop at some common store meant for commoners instead. Back then, her sister's face always wore such an innocent expression that Navia had never once suspected any malice behind it. In this final rebirth, Navia now understood clearly, with sober clarity, that this had simply been her sister's way of protecting her position as the true daughter of the Duke. A small scheme aimed at her. Though her sister was only 6 years old now, would she really be capable of such thoughts yet? Navia instructed Charlotte to keep the matter of the Anthill boutique a secret. She had no wish to provoke a direct confrontation with her sister right now. Elsewhere, her brother was throwing a fit in his room, shouting that he would absolutely kill her. The nanny rushed in and was stunned at the sight of the young master in such a state, still in his soaked clothes, and hurried to change him into a clean set of pajamas. He told the nanny that Navia had tried to kill him, and that their father had even punished him for it, leaving him wishing he could tear Navia limb from limb. The nanny was righteously indignant, deeply sympathetic to his plight. That lowly girl actually dared to look down on the heir of this noble family, and on a loyal servant like herself, no less, a mere substitute daring to use her allowance as leverage against her. She thought privately to herself, how could an 8-year-old girl possibly have uncovered her embezzlement on her own? Someone must have helped her, and the head chef was very likely in on it with her. She threw herself at the young master's feet to declare her loyalty. Whatever concerns you, I will go through fire and water without hesitation. The next day, in the Duke's library, Navia was still searching for information about the Black Moon. Charlotte informed her that there would be no lessons that day, since the tutor had taken a 4-day leave. Navia knew exactly why. He had to be treating her sister's illness. It seemed everything was finally set in motion. This little girl had lived through 8 rebirths without ever once tasting a single glass of apple juice. When a maid mentioned bringing her a cup of apple juice, Navia's eyes lit up with gratitude. The Duke had always forbidden her from drinking juice or eating sweets in order to control her weight. But this time, Charlotte had decided to secretly fill her a large, generous cup. Navia continued flipping through the ancient texts in search of information about the Black Moon, but most of the books contained nothing relevant. There was one last book left, about the gods beyond this world. Could it be that her repeated rebirths and the Black Moon were somehow connected to these outer gods? These gods existed beyond the reach of magic and the laws of this world, and reincarnation itself clearly didn't follow the natural rules of this realm. Perhaps she possessed some fragment of an outer god's omnipotent power. Thinking of this, Navia recalled her birth parents. Perhaps they knew something about all this. But she had only been a year old when they abandoned her at the door of an orphanage, leaving nothing behind but a card with her name written on it, no other information at all. Navia closed the book with a disappointed sigh. She frowned slightly, her tone carrying a hint of quiet reproach. At least they didn't forget to give me a name before they threw me away. Meanwhile, Charlotte went to the kitchen to prepare food, and found her sister's personal maids already there. Charlotte had no interest in dealing with them and simply went about her own work. One of the maids remarked with a sneer that preparing food for Lady Navia must be so easy. Unlike them, who had so much more to prepare, it was simply exhausting. Charlotte glanced over and noticed they had placed all the apple juice on their own trays. The maid with the dyed blonde hair noticed Charlotte watching and remarked that their young lady often shared her apple juice with them, so taking it all wouldn't be a problem. She even laughed. I wonder if Lady Navia has ever even tasted apple juice before. Charlotte turned away angrily, ignoring them. Just then, the blonde maid gave a signal, and something was slipped into one of the cups of apple juice. She handed the tampered cup to Charlotte with a smile. It's just a cup of juice. It's fine if you sneak it over to Lady Navia. Charlotte hesitated, unsure whether she should accept it. The blonde maid thought spitefully to herself that Navia had made their young lady suffer the day before, and now it was time for payback. Charlotte remembered the hopeful look in Navia's eyes, and despite her suspicions, she knew she had to bring this juice back regardless. After a moment's thought, she calmly accepted the cup, and to thank them, offered to help prepare the young lady's meal. A moment later, Charlotte picked up one of the cups of juice and asked, "Is this the tray meant for the young lady's juice?" The blonde maid snatched the cup right out of her hands. "Let's just leave it here." With everything in place, Charlotte took Navia's meal and left. Once the door closed behind her, the maids burst into laughter, each raising a cup of juice to toast their little celebration. As it turned out, they had laced Navia's juice with laxatives. Since the Duke already forbade her from drinking juice, if it gave her diarrhea, she wouldn't dare make a fuss about it and would have no choice but to swallow the humiliation. The group happily carried their trays upstairs, eager not to miss the show. Suddenly, one maid's tray crashed to the floor as she clutched her stomach, trembling all over. The blonde maid snapped at her irritably. "What's going on? The young lady specifically asked for apple juice last night." But the maid kneeling on the floor insisted her stomach was in terrible pain. It was only then that the blonde maid realized, could Charlotte have swapped the cups while helping them prepare the food? Watch closely, this girl, an adopted daughter of the Duke's household, had lived through 8 rebirths without ever once tasting a single cup of apple juice. A maid woke the sleeping Navia, reminding her it was time to eat, and knowing she'd caught a slight cold, brought along some cold medicine as well. Groggy, Navia sat up, and the maid told her she'd also brought along some apple juice. Navia's eyes widened in surprise as if she'd just heard something unbelievable. Looking at the generous, brimming cup of juice in Charlotte's hands, she was overjoyed. "I can't believe she actually managed to bring it." She took the cup with both hands. In her past lives, though she had eaten apples a few times, she had never once had the chance to drink apple juice. Navia held the large cup and took a small, gentle sip. She froze, feeling as though she were surrounded by countless blooming flowers, a flavor she had never experienced before. It was so wonderfully sweet. Seeing the young lady's astonished expression, Charlotte smiled happily as well. Looking down at the juice in her hands, Navia finally understood what apple juice was supposed to taste like. The next moment, she glanced over at Charlotte beside her and offered her the cup, insisting she have some too. Though Charlotte had tasted apple juice before, it was still a rare treat for her, and she was deeply touched that the young lady, even though this was her very first taste, still wanted to share it with her. She also felt relieved that she hadn't let Navia down and had successfully brought the juice as promised. Charlotte handed the cup back, insisting the young lady finish the rest herself. With no lessons today and a delicious cup of apple juice to boot, Navia felt like this was turning into one of the happiest days she could remember, as though it were her birthday. Charlotte then recounted what had happened in the kitchen earlier, that the juice had come from her sister's maids, but worried they might have tampered with it. She had secretly swapped cups while helping them with their work. Navia thought it over. Having lived through so many rebirths, she knew the blonde maid's temperament well, and it was entirely plausible she would try something like that. She asked Charlotte whether the tampered cup would end up being drunk by someone else. Recalling that the maids had placed all the juice cups together on the same tray, Charlotte confirmed that it would. Hearing this, Navia leapt out of bed, grabbed the cold medicine from the tray, and poured the entire dose into the juice. Charlotte looked at her in confusion, unsure what she meant by this, since it would ruin the taste of the juice completely. Just then, the door burst open with a click, and the blonde maid stormed in with the butler right behind her. She pointed at the cup of apple juice on the table and declared to the butler, "Look, this cup is identical to ours. No wonder we were missing one." Charlotte was outraged. That was the very cup the maid had handed her herself. The blonde maid sighed dramatically. Stealing and refusing to admit it, how shameless. The butler spoke up, scolding Charlotte for defying the Duke's orders even under the pretense of caring for the young lady. The blonde maid pressed further. "She even put laxatives in our juice, made some of us sick to our stomachs. If Lady Navia had drunk it, the consequences would have been unthinkable." The butler felt a headache coming on. If the Duke found out about this, he would certainly be blamed for mismanagement, but with the young lady's own maid standing right there as a witness, there was no way to smooth this over. After a moment's thought, he decided to demote Charlotte to work in the laundry room instead. Navia clutched her stomach and cried out, "My stomach hurts so much." This girl had just drunk her very first cup of apple juice in her entire life, yet the moment she finished it, she was doubled over in pain. trembling all over. Charlotte looked utterly confused, certain the juice she'd brought had been perfectly fine. So why was this happening? Then it hit her. She remembered Navia pouring the cold medicine into the juice earlier. Ah, I see. Realizing the young lady was putting on an act, Charlotte indignantly turned on the blonde maid. You gave me that juice to hurt Lady Navia, didn't you? The blonde maid denied it aloud, but inside her thoughts were in complete turmoil. There had only been one cup with the laxative in it, and that cup had already been drunk by one of their own people, so why was Navia the one suffering now? She insisted stubbornly that the cup Charlotte had taken was perfectly fine, and that Charlotte must be putting on this act just to dodge punishment. Charlotte, meanwhile, had grown calm, sensing that the blonde maid was now the one panicking, having already let something slip without meaning to. She seized on the crack in her story, asking why she was so certain there had only been one laced cup. How could she possibly know that for sure? The blonde maid stammered incoherently. Well, that juice you took was definitely fine anyway. Charlotte turned to the butler and said that while getting to the bottom of the truth mattered, if they kept delaying, the young lady's condition might worsen. The butler looked momentarily at a loss. The blonde maid, refusing to believe it, grabbed the cup of juice and took a large gulp, only to spit it right back out on the spot. She was stunned. Could this be the very cup that had been laced after all? Then why had the other maid who drunk from the tray also gotten sick? Charlotte pressed her advantage, pointing out that Lady Navia had never had apple juice before and had no idea what it was even supposed to taste like. Yet, judging by the blonde maid's own reaction, there was clearly something wrong with this cup. The butler, growing impatient, demanded the blonde maid explain herself properly. She fumbled, unable to answer, caught completely off guard, and finally admitted that perhaps she'd simply made a mistake, that the apples used for the juice might not have been fresh. The butler, wanting nothing more than to settle this quickly and quietly, worried that if the Duke found out, he himself would face serious consequences. He snapped at the blonde maid to go fetch the doctor to examine Navia at once, warning her that if anything else went wrong, she wouldn't be forgiven so easily. Charlotte added mockingly that she'd better hurry, since any delay in Lady Navia's treatment would be entirely her fault. Furious, the blonde maid stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The butler warned Charlotte that she was never again to defy the Duke's wishes or feed Navia anything she wasn't supposed to have. He also mentioned that clothing from the Anthill boutique would be delivered the next morning, and asked if Charlotte needed anything sent along with it. Charlotte understood perfectly well that this was the butler's way of placating her, hoping she wouldn't report him to the Duke. Playing along, she put on a grateful expression and thanked him for his kindness. Once the butler left, Navia returned to her usual composed self, the whole ordeal having been nothing but an act. She had Charlotte pour the medicine-laced juice into a flower pot, which Charlotte was already preparing to do. Navia was thoroughly pleased with how well Charlotte had performed, the two of them working together in perfect harmony. The next day, the clothes from the Anthill boutique arrived downstairs. The maid stationed outside her sister's room spotted the delivery, and assuming the clothes were meant for the Duke's biological daughter, rushed off delightedly to report the news. Her sister broke into a radiant smile. Really? In her 8th rebirth, Navia had just received her very first gift box of clothing from the Duke. Her sister's maid was the first to spot the Anthill boutique staff entering the estate, and assuming the gift box was meant for the young lady, rushed off immediately to share the news. Hearing it, her sister smiled brilliantly, thinking that since she'd been upset over her brother's antics the day before yesterday, and hadn't even gotten to enjoy apple juice yesterday, her father must be sending her a gift to cheer her up. She decided to go call for Navia to come admire the gift with her. The blonde maid agreed wholeheartedly, certain that Navia needed to be reminded just how pathetic her own situation was by comparison. Her sister eagerly asked when the gift would arrive, unable to contain her excitement. A maid poked her head out to check, only to witness something entirely unexpected. The gift didn't seem to be heading toward this room at all. At Navia's door, the Anthill boutique staff knocked politely, and Charlotte opened the door to welcome them in. The blonde maid was utterly stunned. She never could have imagined the Duke would send Navia clothing from the Anthill boutique. Her sister noticed something was off too. Walking to the doorway, she watched as the group carried the gifts into the room across the hall instead. She wandered over to that door in a daze and peeked her head inside, only to see Navia sitting elegantly in a chair sipping tea. Her sister was momentarily baffled. Why would Navia be here? It took her a moment to recall that Navia had mentioned moving to the 3rd floor, So this must be her room now, which meant all these gifts were meant for her. Navia caught sight of her sister standing in the doorway and greeted her with a warm smile. But by then, her sister's mind had already gone into a state of complete shock. She suddenly remembered that Navia had come into this family to take her place and marry the prince. She had always felt a sense of superiority over Navia, but in this moment she suddenly realized the truth. Navia was the one their father had brought in to replace her, and everything she had would eventually be taken away by her. The thought was too much to bear. Her sister bolted back to her room in a panic and slammed the door shut behind her with a loud bang. Seeing the maids inside, she screamed at them to get out immediately. Inside Navia's room, Charlotte worried that her sister's reaction might somehow reflect badly on Navia, fearing there might be unpleasant rumors afterward. But Navia understood the situation perfectly. Once word of this spread, people would only say she was an unworthy, lowly adopted daughter who didn't deserve such gifts, and with her sister so distraught, everyone would assume Navia had bullied her. If the Duke had simply prepared a gift for her sister as well, none of this chaos would have happened, but this was exactly what Navia wanted. Navia told Charlotte not to worry about her, and simply to keep quiet about it. The Duke was an extremely arrogant man who believed he could control everything perfectly. Once this incident spread, it would turn her brother, her sister, and even the entire household against Navia, which in turn would make everyone question the Duke's decision to adopt her, something his enormous ego could never tolerate. Once cracks began to show within the estate, her plan to escape would proceed all the more smoothly. This was the first time this girl had ever received a gift from her adoptive father, yet not a single piece of clothing fit her properly. Navia opened the gift box to find nothing but top-tier gowns inside. Charlotte excitedly picked up a pink little dress. "Look how adorable this one is." She held it up against Navia to check the size, only to find, embarrassingly, that every piece was a size too small. Navia smiled ruefully. These clothes looked as though they'd been pulled straight from her sister's own closet. Neither the colors nor the styles matching Navia's taste at all. Charlotte laughed awkwardly and put the clothes away, while Navia simply turned away, no longer paying it any mind. In this lifetime, she had already seen through everything. She wouldn't feel overwhelming gratitude over such a small gesture from the Duke, nor would she feel disheartened that the clothes didn't fit. Charlotte happened to find a lovely accessory among the items and thought it might suit Navia, so she set it aside for her. After putting away the clothes, Charlotte went to bring some food. Navia agreed absently, watching Charlotte bustle about, quietly sighing to herself. She felt Charlotte didn't need to care for her so earnestly, since in just 2 more days, she would be escaping this estate entirely. 5 days after she and the tutor had signed their mage's contract, the Queen would send an invitation to the Duke, who would certainly attend, since doing so would work in his favor when it came to switching his daughter's betrothal to the prince once she recovered. By then, Navia planned to take advantage of the Duke's absence, coax her brother into taking her outside, and use the opportunity to escape to Duke Reed's estate, exactly as she had planned. As for Duke Reed, despite having lived through several rebirths, Navia had never once actually met him. Rumor had it that even when summoned by the Emperor himself, he never appeared in person, and that the area around his estate had been shrouded in darkness by his own magic. Some said he was an extraordinarily powerful mage who avoided people because of his hideous appearance, while others claimed he was actually remarkably handsome and simply chose to hide himself away to avoid drawing attention. Navia couldn't quite figure out why Duke Reed kept such a low profile, but it was precisely this air of mystery and pressure that ensured no one dared provoke the Reed family carelessly, even in their current state of decline. There was also the second prince, Creed, who had risen to prominence through his connection to the Reed family. At a royal ball during Navia's previous rebirth, her engagement to the prince had been called off the moment her sister recovered from her illness. The nobles had whispered among themselves, calling her filth, unworthy of ever becoming heir to the family. It was at that very moment that a noble man had made an extremely inappropriate advance toward her at the banquet. Navia had panicked and wrenched her wrist free from his grip, and in the struggle her dress had been soaked with spilled drinks, and she had stumbled and fallen. She had tried to flee somewhere no one could find her, but the man who had harassed her kept following. Just then, a man had stepped in front of her, his cold, piercing gaze alone enough to drive off the shameless brute. His striking blue eyes carried a distant, unreadable coolness. With commanding presence, he had asked, "Are you Lady Navia, the Duke's daughter?" This was the first and last time Navia would ever meet Creed up close. She had bowed respectfully to the second prince. "Greetings, Your Highness Prince Creed." Creed had told her he was merely Duke Reed's adopted son, not a prince at all, and had turned to leave, only to stop suddenly at the doorway. He removed his own cloak and offered it to her. "Take this cloak." To avoid stirring up any unflattering rumors about him, Navia hadn't worn Creed's cloak that day, but she had kept it with her regardless, because it was the first time anyone had ever shown her genuine kindness. In this final rebirth, Navia had laid out her escape plan carefully. 2 days from now, the Duke would attend the Queen's banquet, and that would be her chance to flee to Duke Reed's estate, hoping to be taken in as his ward. Though she had no idea exactly when the second Prince Creed might appear once he did, Navia planned to leave Duke Reed's estate and let Creed continue on as his adopted heir instead. For now, she simply needed to survive. Just then, the sound of a servant's frantic shouting echoed through the estate. "The young lady has fainted!" Hearing this, Navia thought quietly to herself that her sister must truly be devastated this time, and that everyone who already resented her would now be even more eager to see her dead. She picked up the accessory Charlotte had set aside for her earlier and pondered quietly. Still, it didn't matter. After all, a crisis was simply an opportunity in disguise. In her sister's room, the Duke looked on in visible panic as his daughter lay uncomfortably in bed. The doctor explained that the young lady had fainted from excessive stress and emotional shock, and that she now needed to stay calm and rest. Only then did the Duke realize his daughter had ended up this way out of jealousy, over Navia receiving clothes from the Anthill boutique. He genuinely couldn't understand it. They were just a few pieces of clothing. Why make such a fuss, especially when Navia was about to be engaged to the prince soon anyway? If word of this childish squabble ever reached the Queen's ears, it would be deeply embarrassing for him. The thought left the Duke thoroughly irritated. This family never gives me a moment's peace. He turned his anger on the maids instead, scolding them for failing to properly look after a child of just a few years old, letting things spiral into this mess. The blonde maid quickly lowered her head to apologize, but the Duke showed no mercy, feeling that if his servants were this incompetent, he couldn't be blamed for being harsh with them. Trembling, the blonde maid sensed the Duke might punish them on the spot and hurried to defend herself, insisting there had been nothing they could do, since Navia had deliberately left her door wide open to flaunt the gifts she'd received, leaving them powerless to stop the young lady's distress. How could mere maids possibly have dared to intervene with Lady Navia? The Duke's brow furrowed. Was this Navia's doing? The blonde maid fanned the flames further, claiming that 2 days earlier it had also been Navia who deliberately claimed she'd been playing in the water with the young master, which was what had upset the young lady so much in the first place. The Duke fell into thought. He considered that if this had been any other child, it might have been plausible. But he had personally confirmed that Navia was still under the effects of the brainwashing, making such behavior on her part impossible. Still, doubt crept back in. He couldn't tell whether he simply hadn't been observing Navia closely enough, or whether the maid standing before him was lying. The next moment, Navia's soft voice called out from the room. "Father." The Duke turned around to see her standing in the doorway, holding a small gift box, her face full of dejection. Navia had once again become the scapegoat. Her sister had fainted from jealousy over the Duke's gifts to Navia, and the blonde maid was now slandering her before the Duke, claiming she had deliberately flaunted her gifts and stirred up conflict between the young master and the young lady. Just as the Duke was weighing the truth of the maid's words, Navia arrived, standing weakly in the doorway with a small gift box in hand, saying she had something to discuss with him. The blonde maid's heart skipped a beat, unsure what nonsense Navia might be about to spout. But the next moment, she noticed the gift box clutched tightly in Navia's arms and immediately recognized it as a gift from the Anthill boutique. A sly smile crept across her face as she deliberately asked what Navia was holding. Before Navia could even explain, the blonde maid cut in. "If I'm not mistaken, isn't that the Anthill boutique's packaging?" She gasped, covering her mouth in mock surprise. "Everyone already knows why the young lady fainted, and yet you still bring this here? Are you trying to flaunt it in her face?" Navia lowered her head and said nothing. Just then, the door was suddenly pushed open, and the nanny strode in. "What? Flaunting it? That's simply outrageous." She and the blonde maid played off each other perfectly, working together to paint Navia as the guilty party. The nanny sighed dramatically, feigning heartbreak, insisting that Navia flaunting gifts in front of the precious young lady was nothing short of an insult. Navia finally began to explain that she had never said any such thing. The nanny thought viciously to herself that the Duke was clearly already growing suspicious, and this was the perfect opportunity to teach Navia a lesson. Without warning, she grabbed Navia's wrist, determined to see for herself exactly what fine gift Navia had brought for the young lady. In the struggle, the gift box slipped from Navia's grasp and fell to the floor, and a plain pearl hairpin rolled out, tumbling across the ground a couple of times. Seeing such a modest accessory, the nanny's tone dripped with disbelief. "Goodness, you've received so many precious gifts, and this is the shabby trinket you chose to bring?" Navia lowered her head in dejection. The blonde maid seized the opportunity to pile on further, and soon the room filled with the maid's murmured criticisms, all condemning Navia for bringing such a cheap, tasteless gift. Though this wasn't the first time Navia had heard such remarks. Every time she remembered this group of people hurling such cruel words at an 8-year-old child, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of sadness. She didn't argue, nor did she panic. Instead, she calmly walked over to the fallen accessory and picked it up, every movement radiating the elegant composure of true nobility. The Duke was momentarily taken aback. Clasping the recovered accessory to her chest, Navia explained to him the reason for her visit. "Actually, all I wanted was a single hairpin. I was being too greedy before." These words caught both the nanny and the maids completely off guard, leaving them speechless. Even the Duke was stunned. Just moments ago, Navia had been at a loss for words under questioning, and yet with a single sentence she had completely turned the situation around. He couldn't help but wonder whether this had all been carefully orchestrated by her from the start. Navia's heart had long since turned to ice, watching this group of people gang up against an 8-year-old girl, while the Duke stood silently to the side, saying nothing at all. In the end, it always came back to her lowly birth. Even accepting a gift required some kind of justification. Though Navia understood everything with perfect clarity, she knew she had to hide her true feelings for now, since the Duke's suspicions toward her hadn't fully faded yet. She lowered her head and apologized to him with visible sorrow. "I was just so happy to receive your gift that I accidentally let my sister see it." She held up the plain hairpin and assured him that this hairpin was all she needed, that she would never ask for anything more after this. Navia's masterful performance successfully won over the Duke. With tears glistening in her eyes, she insisted she would never seek anything more. The Duke's pupils contracted slightly, his fingers tightening. He was genuinely moved by what he took to be her heartfelt sincerity, which also confirmed the brainwashing was working perfectly. No further observation needed. After all, having witnessed countless schemes and power struggles in high society, there was no way he couldn't see through an 8-year-old girl if something were truly amiss. He was thoroughly satisfied with Navia's performance today. Although the earlier chaos had been utterly absurd, the composure Navia displayed throughout was impeccable, every bit the bearing of a true noblewoman, which only reaffirmed to him what excellent judgment he had. Adopting Navia had truly been the right decision. With that thought, the Duke offered her some words of comfort. "Navia, you are also a daughter of this house. No amount you receive would ever be excessive." Hearing this validation, Navia felt nothing but cold indifference inside. If the Duke truly believed what he was saying, why had he been so quick to suspect her just moments ago? On the surface, though, she continued to appear pitiful, insisting it was all her fault that such trouble had broken out in the household. The Duke glared furiously at the nanny and the maids, vowing to get to the bottom of who had caused all this. The nanny's heart lurched in alarm, realizing the Duke seemed to believe Navia's account. She immediately tried to turn the tables, warning him not to be fooled, that Navia was merely playing the victim to win sympathy, and adding that if he only knew how Navia had actually treated her, he wouldn't be so quick to favor her. This remark instantly caught the Duke's attention. The nanny realized too late that she had let something slip in her panic. If Navia chose this moment to expose her embezzlement, she would surely be finished. She immediately changed her tune, claiming that she and Navia had simply had a small disagreement and that it was her own fault for not taking better care of the young lady. The Duke, thoroughly unsatisfied with the nanny's incoherent excuse, demanded to know why she kept finding fault with Navia at every turn. The nanny hastily explained that she had simply been too upset and had mistakenly believed the maid's account, and begged the Duke to forgive her recklessness. The Duke slowly drew his sword. "It seems I trusted you far too much, allowing a servant so full of lies to remain in this household." As the blade turned toward her, The blonde maid dropped to her knees in terror, trembling as she begged the Duke's forgiveness. The nanny knelt as well, frantically calculating in her mind. The ledger recording her embezzlement had already been destroyed, and she had commissioned a forged one that would arrive any moment now, which would be enough to turn things around in her favor. But the Duke had no interest in hearing any more excuses and raised his sword to strike. Just then, the Duke's biological daughter stirred awake, calling out weakly for her father, and the hand holding the raised sword froze in midair. He turned to see his daughter blinking sleepily, yawning, and asked with concern if she was feeling any better. But what she saw was her father holding a massive sword, looking as though he were about to kill someone. Terrified, she begged him not to kill the nanny and the maid, bursting into tears as she spoke. The Duke immediately lowered his sword and went to her side, gently stroking her hair, promising he wouldn't kill them. Navia watched coldly from the sidelines as this touching display of father-daughter affection unfolded, silently scoffing to herself. What a loving father he truly is. Navia's suffering ran deep. She had lived through 8 rebirths chasing after her family's love, and in this final life, all she had received in return was unfair treatment from every single person in the estate, even having to sit through this touching little scene between the Duke and his real daughter. She was truly exhausted, as if she'd been fighting an endless war, but for now, she could only bear it, since she'd soon be free of this place entirely. In this final rebirth, she understood clearly that there were many secrets about herself she still didn't understand, like the black moon mark that had appeared on her wrist, though she had no idea why. As she walked back to her room, the pearl hairpin slipped from her hair and fell to the ground. This unassuming little hairpin was her hard-won trophy, and should anyone try to harm her again, it would become her weapon. This silent, bloodless battle was far from over. Navia had to steel herself, understanding that only by hardening her heart could she possibly survive. Though deep down she was truly exhausted, this endless war with her family draining her emotionally and mentally without end, she felt like a hedgehog, wounding others even as she wounded herself in the process. Navia picked up the pearl hairpin and clenched her jaw. Even so, she couldn't afford to give up now. She pinned the hairpin back into her hair like loading a weapon. Navia told herself, "It's fine, I'm safe for now." In her sister's room, the Duke comforted his daughter, telling her she shouldn't have been jealous over Navia receiving so many gifts, since she was, after all, the true daughter of this household. He promised to buy her even more clothes and jewelry, and she finally settled down. The Duke was thoroughly satisfied with Navia's performance today. He had been delaying her engagement to the prince, waiting for her to become properly versed in royal etiquette, and to appease the queen in the meantime, he'd had no choice but to keep sending tributes of magic stones. But Navia's performance today had exceeded his expectations, meaning he could now offer the queen slightly less in tribute, and could even tell her he planned to bring Navia along to the pre-engagement meeting ceremony. To prevent his son from causing trouble for Navia at this critical moment, the Duke decided to assign a few knights to keep an eye on him and keep him from wandering off. Meanwhile, Navia returned to her own room and let out a long breath of relief. But the next instant, her eyes went wide with shock. Her personal maid, Charlotte, lay unconscious on the floor, while her brother stood leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his tone dripping with mockery. "Where have you been wandering off to? What took you so long to get back?" He curled his lips into a wicked grin. "Get her." No sooner had the words left his mouth than a sharp crack rang out, and Navia collapsed, unconscious. Once again, Navia had fallen victim to her brother's scheme. The moment she'd returned to her room, her brother, lying in ambush, had used magic to subdue her, and a guard had knocked her out with a single blow from behind. Her brother scratched his head and ordered 2 guards to carry Charlotte to a side room, while another accompanied him in moving Navia to a storehouse outside. His eyes gleamed with malice. This time he intended to give her a proper beating, confident that after half a day locked away, Navia would be begging him for mercy through her tears. The guards worried about being caught by the Duke, but her brother waved off the concern, boasting that he would use magic to slip down from the balcony without anyone noticing. His eyes shone with anticipation of the revenge he was about to exact, determined to teach this filthy girl exactly who belonged at the top. Under the effect of the magic, Navia's unconscious body slowly floated into the air, her eyes shut tight. Outside in the courtyard, her brother led the way while the guards followed him into a dim, dark room where they set Navia down on the floor. He wore a wicked grin, planning to strike her only in places that clothing could hide, so their father would never find out. Just as he was about to begin, a guard rushed in urgently, telling him to hurry back to his own room, since the Duke had sent several knights to keep watch on him, and they were currently searching everywhere for him. Her brother couldn't understand why his father had suddenly decided to have him watched. The guard explained that the Duke was heading to the capital for a few days. Her brother stroked his chin thoughtfully, deciding this actually worked in his favor. Once their father left, there would be no one left to protect Navia, and he could find a way to shake off the knights and come back to deal with her properly later. With that, he left with the guard, locking the unconscious Navia inside the room behind him. Elsewhere, the nanny paced anxiously back and forth in her room, having narrowly escaped death at the Duke's hands. She believed her unwavering loyalty had brought her to this point entirely because of Navia's scheming, convinced the Duke must have been deceived by her. Clenching her fists in frustration, she told herself that as long as she could redeem herself now, everything would return to normal. Just then, someone knocked at her door. The forged ledger she'd been counting on to turn the tables had finally arrived. A sinister smile spread across the nanny's face. Her chance had come. All she needed to do was add Charlotte's name to the ledger, then have the fabricated stolen goods delivered to her room. And the plan would be complete, clearing her own name while also taking down both Charlotte and the head chef in one stroke. With everything prepared, the nanny marched confidently to the Duke's study, ledger in hand, and pushed open the door, expecting to present it to the Duke himself. Instead, she found only the butler seated inside. "The Duke has already departed for the capital. Is there something you need?" Navia was in a truly dire situation, having been kidnapped by her brother and locked away in a storehouse where no one paid her any mind. Meanwhile, the nanny had brought along a forged ledger to accuse Charlotte of conspiring with the head chef to frame her. But since the Duke had already left for the capital, it fell to the butler to manage all the estate's affairs, large and small, in his absence. The nanny complained to the butler that she and Navia had always had some tension between them, and that the root of the conflict lay in this very ledger. With that, she handed over the fabricated ledger for him to examine. After reading through it, the butler rose to his feet in astonishment. "Are you saying the head chef has been colluding with our family's food suppliers to falsify accounts?" The nanny declared indignantly that the chef wasn't acting alone in this, that Charlotte was involved as well. The butler recalled that Charlotte was Navia's personal maid, wondering if this meant Navia herself was somehow tied to the matter too. The nanny seized the opening, insisting that Navia was indeed involved, that the three of them had conspired together and were now trying to pin the blame on her. The matter had grown far too complicated, leaving the butler deep in thought. The nanny, meanwhile, was scheming darkly to herself, thinking that even if this didn't manage to bring Navia down, the important thing was to stir up public opinion against her, convincing everyone that she was misbehaving. Sooner or later, that would give her the opening she needed to properly punish Navia. With that thought, she broke into tears, pleading with the butler to see justice done on her behalf. Shortly after, the head chef was escorted before the butler by guards, still unaware of what was happening. Moments later, guards brought in a large chest filled with all manner of jewelry and luxury goods. Another guard searched Charlotte's room and found additional stolen items, but no matter how thoroughly they searched, Charlotte herself was nowhere to be found. The nanny was somewhat taken aback. At such a critical moment, Charlotte had gone into hiding, as if the heavens themselves were on her side. She had originally worried that the stolen goods alone might not be enough to convict her, but now, not only had the charges been confirmed, but they could add fleeing from justice to the list as well. She immediately suggested to the butler that they send people to hunt Charlotte down right away. Lost in thought, the butler reflected that Charlotte had made one mistake after another recently, and now with solid evidence against her as well, he needed to capture her before the Duke returned no matter what. Otherwise, if the Duke came back to find that even a lowly maid had escaped without a trace, the butler himself might not survive the fallout. He ordered additional men dispatched to ensure Charlotte was caught. By nightfall, the guards had finally located Charlotte, though oddly enough, she hadn't fled at all, but lay unconscious in a side room that had been locked from outside. The guards speculated that someone must have knocked her out and locked her in there deliberately. The situation had grown even more tangled. The nanny, feeling somewhat uneasy herself now, suggested to the butler that perhaps the head chef had done this to cover up his own crimes. The butler, too, sensed something was off, finding the nanny's eagerness to help somewhat excessive. Just then, a guard stammered that he hadn't seen Lady Navia at all since that afternoon. This girl had suffered so much, having lived through 8 rebirths all in pursuit of her family's love. And in this final life, all she'd received was unfair treatment from every member of her adoptive family. Navia had been locked away in the storehouse by her brother, while the nanny was busy accusing her of conspiring with the head chef to frame her for embezzlement. When the Duke returned from the capital, the butler filled him in on everything that had happened in his absence. Someone had brazenly committed embezzlement. Navia had gone missing, and her maid Charlotte had been found knocked out and locked in a side room. The Duke slammed his fist onto the table in fury. He'd only been gone a single day, and the entire estate had nearly fallen into chaos. Of course, his anger had nothing to do with genuine concern for Navia's safety. It was because he had just promised the Queen he would bring Navia to the meeting ceremony, and now this had happened. The Duke's voice thundered throughout the estate. "Turn the entire capital upside down if you have to, but find Navia and bring her back to me." Elsewhere, Navia woke from her unconscious state to find herself surrounded by total darkness, unable to see a thing. Her brother's despicable face flashed through her mind. She never could have imagined he would defy the Duke's explicit warning and attack her again. But dwelling on that now was pointless. Navia forced herself to stay calm and checked over her own body. Her hands and feet weren't bound, and her mouth wasn't gagged. But knowing her brother's character, this surely wasn't as simple as just locking her away. He probably meant to beat her, but had suddenly been interrupted by something. Or perhaps he simply wasn't in a rush, meaning he could return at any moment. Navia got to her feet and brushed the dust off herself. She couldn't just sit here and wait to be found, she had to do something. But the pitch darkness made moving nearly impossible, so she felt her way along the walls. The air carried a musty smell, and she noticed crates stacked all around her. This had to be some kind of storehouse. As she moved backward, she accidentally bumped into a crate with a loud thud, and quickly clapped a hand over her own mouth in fear, worried that if someone were standing guard outside, that noise alone could seal her fate. Navia crouched in the corner and stayed perfectly still for a long while before finally relaxing. It seemed there was no one outside after all. She continued searching the room, hoping to find something useful. No matter what happened, she was determined to survive. She had no idea how much time had passed when she heard the chirping of birds outside, a sign that dawn had broken. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She hadn't eaten a single thing since being kidnapped the previous morning. She pressed a hand to her stomach and leaned against the wall as it growled audibly, but she couldn't afford to stop moving, or she'd have no way of escaping before her brother returned. She finally felt her way to the storehouse door. It was locked, but the door itself looked old and worn. Perhaps she could break it open. Navia threw her entire weight against the door with all the strength she had, but it was futile. The door didn't budge an inch. She sat down on the ground, gasping for breath, realizing that even at full strength she probably couldn't have broken it down. But she had to find a way out of here before her brother came back. Just then, she felt a puddle of water seeping in beneath her palm. Puzzled, she wondered why the floor would be wet like this, especially when only this particular spot had water pooling on it. Then it struck her. It had been raining for the past several days. There had to be a reason water was seeping in from somewhere. Navia began shifting the crates in the corner, and sure enough, discovered a small gap behind them, just large enough for a dog to pass through. Navia had been locked away in the storehouse by her brother, but she had discovered a gap just large enough to crawl through. No matter what, she was determined to get out of this place. In the woods on the Duke's estate, her brother was leading a group of servants toward the storehouse where Navia was being held. He felt considerably on edge, since at his father's orders, the entire household had been searching for Navia's whereabouts, fortunately without success so far. He intended to give her a proper thrashing now and threaten her into keeping quiet about the kidnapping. Just then, his eyes went wide with disbelief, because standing right in front of him, having just crawled out through the gap, was Navia herself. She hadn't expected to run straight into him either, and without a moment's hesitation, she scrambled to her feet and bolted. Behind her, she could hear her brother's furious, panicked voice shouting, "Catch her now!" An 8-year-old girl was never going to outrun a 20-year-old man. Within just a few steps, one of the servants grabbed her from behind. But Navia refused to give up without a fight, pulling the pearl hairpin from her hair and jabbing it viciously into the servant's arm. He yelped in pain and let go, and Navia broke free again, running once more. Her brother cursed the servant as useless for failing to catch a small girl, knowing full well that this time he could not afford to let Navia escape, or their father would show him no mercy. He raised his hand, gathering blue water magic in his palm, and as Navia ran, she suddenly felt a powerful force slam into her back, leaving her with no strength left to keep fleeing. The magic in her brother's hand dissipated. "Now you understand the difference in our strength, don't you, you stupid piece of filth?" Navia crumpled to the ground, her whole body trembling. Her brother continued taunting her mercilessly. "You just got lucky last time stealing my magic. Do you really think you can beat me again?" He grabbed her by the collar, his face twisted with malice. "Even without using magic, you're still no match for me." As he tightened his grip, Navia struggled to breathe, instinctively grabbing hold of his wrist. In that moment, she heard with startling clarity the sound of a heartbeat pounding, thump, thump. Her brother's sneering face hung frozen before her, and everything around them seemed to fall utterly still. Had time itself stopped? Navia found herself facing her brother's raised fist, and in the split second before it fell, time seemed to freeze completely. Yet her mind remained perfectly clear, and she realized time hadn't truly stopped. It had simply slowed to an extraordinary crawl. She looked up into her brother's eyes and saw nothing but contempt and disgust there, as though she had never before observed him this closely. Navia tightened her grip on her brother's wrist, her gaze turning razor-sharp, because she now understood with certainty that she could use the Black Moon's power to steal his magic. A blinding light flared behind her as a massive surge of magical energy poured out of her brother's body, the power of the Black Moon capable of stealing not just magic actively cast against her, but also drawing power directly through physical contact. Her brother finally sensed that something was terribly wrong. Instead of the pleading he'd expected from Navia, he felt a surge of magic swelling around him instead. Listening to the crackling static building within her brother's body, Navia recognized the telltale signs of magic overload approaching. It seemed she had successfully absorbed all of his power. Panicking, her brother shoved Navia away. By all rights, someone suffering magic overload should have their body rupture and vomit blood, yet he remained completely unharmed. Proof that the Black Moon possessed power that defied all natural laws. Navia lifted her head, eyes wide, magic swirling around her as a mocking smile spread across her face. "You should have run while you had the chance, idiot." Meanwhile, the Duke sighed heavily, lamenting that nothing had gone right for him lately, with Navia still nowhere to be found. If she truly had gone missing, he would not only need to cancel tomorrow's meeting ceremony with the Queen, but would also have to send along a substantial gift of apology. Worse still, finding another adopted daughter as beautiful as Navia would be no easy task. Just then, the Duke's pupils dilated. Outside his window, a blinding flash of light erupted, and he felt an overwhelming surge of power. Looking out through the window, he saw a towering column of water spiraling up into the sky like a tornado. The Duke felt a chill run through him. This wasn't anywhere near the ocean, so how could such powerful water magic possibly be manifesting here? And this particular signature of power felt disturbingly familiar. His fingers clenched tight as an impossible thought crept into his mind. Could this be his own son? Moments later, the Duke arrived at the epicenter of the magical vortex, finding the area completely devastated, the magic saturating the air as thick as mist rolling off a lake. This was clearly the aftermath of a magic overload, and given how concentrated the residual magic still was, whoever had caused it was very likely in mortal danger. Sure enough, the Duke spotted his own son lying amid the wreckage. Fury boiled up inside him as he rushed over and gathered his son into his arms. His son's mouth was bleeding, having sustained internal injuries, but he was still breathing and his body remained warm. Just then, a servant reported that Navia had also been found nearby. The Duke ground his teeth in rage. Of course, his son had been the one to abduct Navia, causing yet another disaster. But right now, the most important thing was keeping his son alive. Navia was nothing more than an object to him after all, and even if his son had genuinely killed her, replacing her would just be a matter of some effort. This poor girl lay injured and unconscious on the ground, and all her adoptive father had to say, in the flattest tone imaginable, was, "Well, at least she's not seriously hurt." He then simply ordered the servants to take her to see a doctor. In his mind, the Duke was already calculating how to use Navia's injury as an excuse to postpone tomorrow's meeting with the Queen, though he suspected word of his son's magic overload would spread regardless. With a water tornado of that magnitude occurring right on his own territory, the Queen was unlikely to simply let the matter go, so he needed to find a scapegoat to bring this whole affair to a close. Just then, something on the ground caught the Duke's attention, a pearl hairpin lying near his feet. He recognized it immediately as the very hairpin Navia had been wearing the day before, now stained with traces of blood. A guard reported from behind him that the servant responsible for watching over the young master had also been found nearby, and was brought forward, kneeling and trembling before the Duke. The sight of him sent a fresh wave of fury through the Duke, certain that his son must have used this servant to help kidnap Navia. Without hesitation, he ordered the man bound and charged with the abduction of his adopted daughter. The servant's eyes widened in terror upon hearing this. He tried to defend himself, insisting he had merely followed the young master's orders and had no choice in the matter. The Duke struck him hard across the face. "How dare you slander my son?" In his mind, he quickly assembled a convenient story to explain away this entire disaster, that this ungrateful servant had schemed to kidnap Navia and lock her away, and that his own son, upon discovering the plot, had bravely risked his own safety to rescue his sister. Satisfied with this version of events, the Duke ordered the servant thrown into prison. Though the man continued to protest his innocence, there was no waking someone who was only pretending to sleep. The Duke mused privately that having just one servant take the fall clearly wouldn't be enough. Conveniently, he still needed to deal with the head chef and that maid named Charlotte. Perhaps he could pin the blame on all of them together. Inside Charlotte's room at the estate, she sat with her chin propped in her hands, sighing. Charlotte's dream was to leave this place someday and open her own little cafe, where she could bake jams and scones. She had no idea when she would finally save enough money to buy her freedom and end her lifelong contract with this family. Having been accused of embezzlement, she now found herself confined to her own room. Just then, a large group of maids came pouring into her room. These were the very servants she had won over in her efforts to undermine the nanny, though in truth they too had simply been after the money the nanny had embezzled. Charlotte now realized that this entire group of people had likely just been pawns manipulated by Lady Navia all along. Navia had used the Black Moon to steal her brother's magic, but the counterattack had left her unconscious as well. Meanwhile, Charlotte had been reported by the nanny and confined to her room under accusations of embezzlement, and the servants she had recruited, terrified of getting caught up in the fallout, came rushing to question her choices. Charlotte remained composed, calming everyone down, explaining that the nanny had betrayed the head chef, which was exactly why this accusation had come about in the first place, when in truth, the nanny and the chef had been in it together all along. Charlotte gritted her teeth. Navia had originally told her not to reveal the nanny's embezzlement to anyone, but at this point there was no other option left. She asked the maids to go tell the head chef in prison that the nanny had betrayed him. Knowing his temper, he would surely drag the nanny down with him in retaliation. Meanwhile, in the Duke's chambers, the butler reported the findings from his investigation into the ledger the nanny had submitted, confirming that the head chef truly had embezzled funds, though the portion implicating Charlotte didn't quite add up. The Duke wasn't particularly concerned about Charlotte's situation and decided to focus first on postponing the meeting with the Queen. Just then, a group of servants and maids gathered outside the Duke's door, intent on exposing the nanny. After hearing them out, the Duke finally learned the truth, that the nanny and the head chef had been embezzling together from the very start, and that the stolen goods found in Charlotte's room had actually belonged to the nanny all along. The Duke felt a chill run through him. He understood that this group of servants held a grudge against the nanny, so their eagerness to expose her made perfect sense, but he hadn't expected them to band together to clear Charlotte's name as well. He had always assumed Charlotte was nothing more than a diligent little maid, but after this incident it seemed she was far more complicated than he'd realized. The Duke stroked his chin thoughtfully. Regardless of the actual truth, he had no shortage of servants who were wholeheartedly loyal to him, so there was no reason to keep someone so difficult to read close by. In the end, the Duke ordered Charlotte reassigned to the laundry room and had a new maid appointed to serve Navia. In his son Wuda's room, the Duke let out a long sigh as he watched his unconscious child. The magic overload would almost certainly leave lasting effects, and although Wuda's life had been spared, he would likely never again be able to use magic as freely as before. The Duke found himself utterly bewildered as to why his son held such intense hatred for Navia, going so far as to bully her even at the risk of his own safety. Seeing his son reduced to this state now, a dark thought crept into the Duke's mind. Perhaps it was time to simply get rid of Navia. After all, accidental deaths among children were hardly uncommon. But then he thought of her flowing silver hair, her fair skin, and those striking, captivating red eyes, and he hesitated. It wasn't out of any real affection for her. Rather, according to certain confidential intelligence, the Crown Prince happened to have a particular fondness for exactly that kind of appearance. And discarding such a valuable asset now would truly be a waste. If Navia could successfully marry the Crown Prince, it would at the very least secure their family's standing for generations to come. Just then, Wood stirred awake. Navia had lived through 8 rebirths, forever treated as nothing more than a tool by her adoptive father, and in this final life, she was determined to escape this family entirely. As her brother Wood regained consciousness, listening to his father describe how he had summoned a tornado and suffered a magic overload, he found he had no memory of any of it, only recalling that he had walked into the forest with his servants, then seen Navia escaping, after which everything went blank. The Duke was utterly stunned. Wood continued trying to recall, remembering flashes of blue sparks scattering everywhere, and afterward a pair of piercing red eyes. The memory sent uncontrollable tremors through his entire body, as though he'd been plunged into overwhelming terror. The next instant, Wood screamed, clutching his head, insisting that everything, all of it, was her fault, that Navia was the one who had done this to him. Watching his son trembling uncontrollably, the Duke rushed to comfort him, telling him not to be afraid, promising he would see justice done. Once Wood had calmed down, the Duke let out another sigh, and the butler informed him that Navia was still asleep. Weighing the benefits that a royal marriage through Navia could bring, the Duke felt thoroughly conflicted and instructed the butler to begin preparations for their departure to the capital. Just then, Navia's tutor, Edward, unexpectedly requested an audience. The Duke, his brow furrowed, said he had no interest in seeing him right now. A servant reported that Edward insisted he had something extremely important to relay to the Duke immediately. Moments later, the Duke asked impatiently, "What is it?" Edward cleared his throat lightly. "I've come to see you because I've found the cure for magic reflux disease." Upon hearing this, the Duke's eyes widened instantly. He shot up from his seat, demanding confirmation that this was truly real. Edward nodded, explaining that he had already used it to cure his own sister, who suffered from the very same illness. The Duke's hands trembled with excitement. This meant his daughter could finally be saved. Though magic reflux disease was a severe condition, the actual treatment turned out to be surprisingly simple. Edward used his own magic to treat the Duke's daughter, and within moments, her entire body glowed with a burst of magical light as her magic flow returned to normal. The Duke was overjoyed, never having imagined such a turning point could still occur, having already all but given up on his daughter. The Duke swept his daughter into his arms as she asked curiously whether her illness was finally cured. He told her gently that she was now perfectly healthy. Watching the little girl's face light up with joy, the Duke knew in his heart that this child was destined to become queen one day. Once the treatment was complete, the Duke thanked Edward, who insisted he had simply done his duty. Edward touched the ring on his index finger, the very mark of the mage's contract he had signed with Navia. With seemingly casual curiosity, he asked, "So, what do you plan to do with Lady Navia now?" Once again, Navia found herself teetering at the edge of death. Just as promised, Edward had cured the Duke's daughter of her magic reflux disease exactly 5 days later, and now he asked the Duke what he intended to do with Navia. The Duke's first instinct was to have her executed outright, since there was no longer any need to use her for a marriage alliance with the Queen, and his son despised her intensely, besides, leaving him no real reason to keep her around. Just as the Duke was on the verge of sentencing Navia to death, Edward proposed an alternative. What if you sent Lady Navia to the Reed family to become their heir instead? The Duke was confused, so Edward explained further. Your Grace, while you are the wealthiest man in the Empire, your military strength still leaves something to be desired. The Reed family may have fallen into decline, but they still command the most powerful army in the realm. The Duke scoffed, though he had to admit Edward's point held merit. He continued, "Consider this. If Lady Navia became heir to the Reed family, and later married young Master Wood once grown, that family's military strength would naturally fall under your control as well." The Duke had to admit this was quite a clever idea. To keep Wood from causing further trouble, the two would need to be separated for now, and once he matured, he would surely come to understand Navia's true worth. Still, ever cautious, the Duke raised a concern. If Navia truly became heir to the Reed family, plenty of suitors might soon come seeking her hand, which could complicate matters considerably. Edward slowly set down his teacup. "Does your Grace truly believe those potential rivals could pose any real threat to you?" The Duke paused for a moment. Ever arrogant, he had never regarded anyone else as a genuine threat, and to rise to true power, one needed to take risks. Navia was simply a pawn he had cultivated for exactly this purpose. With that thought, the Duke relaxed once more, laughing off the notion that he could ever entertain such an unambitious idea. He then decided to bring Edward along with him to the royal palace, extending an offer for Edward to become his personal retainer. Edward considered the offer carefully. In the past, he might well have accepted such a proposal, but instead he politely declined, claiming he wasn't deserving of such an honor. The Duke paid this little mind, promising he would offer the best possible terms regardless. Not wishing to dwell on the subject any further, Edward excused himself, intending to go check on Navia's condition. Elsewhere, Navia slowly opened her eyes to find she wasn't lying in her own room. She glanced up at the time, already 9 in the morning, and bolted upright. Unsure exactly which day this 9 o'clock belonged to, worried she might have missed her chance to escape while unconscious. She rang the bell beside her bed, but the maid who answered wasn't Charlotte. The maid explained that Charlotte had been demoted to the laundry room for failing to properly serve the young lady. Navia pondered this thoughtfully, sensing that Charlotte's punishment seemed disproportionately harsh, unaware of the storm the nanny had stirred up during the time she'd been missing and unconscious. This girl, in her 8th rebirth, was determined to escape this predatory household once and for all. As Navia roused from her unconscious state, the new maid informed her that the nanny was now being held in prison. This confirmed for Navia that Charlotte must have reported the nanny, which had triggered the Duke's suspicion. Otherwise, she wouldn't have ended up demoted to the laundry room. Still, Navia had specifically told Charlotte not to expose the nanny so soon. Setting aside her concerns about Charlotte for the moment, Navia asked the maid how long she had been unconscious. The maid told her a full day had passed, and Navia breathed a sigh of relief, relieved that her plan hadn't been thrown off course. By her calculations, today was exactly the day Edward was due to fulfill his end of their contract. Still, thinking it over, judging by the maid's reaction, could it be that her brother Wood hadn't said anything at all? He already knew she could steal others' magic to use for herself, and given his temperament, he should have caused an uproar over it by now. Navia, feigning polite concern, asked the maid about Wood's condition. The maid told her that the young master had suffered a magic overload while rescuing her, though he was otherwise fine. Navia sneered inwardly, since when had Wood ever rescued her? Still, she understood perfectly well that the Duke simply wanted this whole incident swept under the rug. Just then, a guard outside announced that Edward had come to see her. Navia invited him in, and sat on the sofa with a cup of black tea in hand, radiating an air of natural nobility as she asked him, "Has your sister's illness been cured?" Edward confirmed that it had, though inwardly he was quite astonished. Navia had been right there when Wood suffered his magic overload, yet she now appeared completely unharmed. Navia took a sip of her tea. Good. A brief silence fell between teacher and student before Edward broke it. "Are you feeling all right yourself?" Navia felt a flicker of confusion, wondering why he would suddenly show concern for her, since it was so unlike his usual demeanor. Edward continued, asking why she had chosen to make her move today of all days. Navia turned the question back on him, asking whether he and the Duke were about to depart for the capital soon. Edward nodded in confirmation. Because when the master of the house is away, the children tend to run wild. At that moment, he finally understood. Navia intended to take advantage of the Duke's absence to throw the entire estate back into chaos once more. Navia had orchestrated the chaos consuming the Duke's estate by manipulating everyone around her. Her tutor Edward was the only person who truly understood what she was after, and he had watched, almost in awe, as she fought tooth and nail to break free of her chains. Given the sheer skill she'd demonstrated, he suspected she must already have some flawless plan mapped out in her mind, and that he himself was nothing more than a piece on her chessboard. Edward felt he could hardly even claim the title of her teacher anymore, though he thought that if he could become her strategist, or perhaps even her ally, he might just get to witness the miracle Navia was destined to create. With that in mind, Edward told Navia that Wood had apparently lost part of his memory, forgetting entirely about the tornado incident. Navia understood at once. No wonder he had been so quiet about it. This would only make her escape from this family that much easier. Just then, the Duke sent word for Edward to depart for the capital. Before leaving, Edward urged Navia to be careful in whatever she was planning. Navia felt a flicker of surprise, sensing that Edward now seemed to have fully aligned himself with her cause. A moment later, Navia gazed out at the autumn rain falling outside her window. Every time, exactly a week after each rebirth, it would rain, the water turning the roads to mud, as though foreshadowing that this rebirth, too, was doomed to fail. Watching the Duke below preparing to depart, she thought that if this rain delayed his return even slightly, it might just work in her favor this time. Navia turned and caught sight of her familiar pearl hairpin, having thought it lost for good. Since it was still here within the estate, she decided to keep up her pitiful, humble act a little longer. She reached out, picked up the hairpin, and fastened it behind her ear. Outside the room of the Duke's true daughter, Vivian, the maids were busy fawning over her, praising her recovery as a blessing from the heavens. Vivian looked up just as Navia happened to walk by. Navia asked with gentle concern why she was already up and about. Vivian's attention, however, was fixed on Navia's shabby dress and the single pearl hairpin she wore, while she herself was dressed in lace-trimmed clothing adorned with various jewels. She finally came to a conclusion: Navia truly was nothing more than a fraud. She rushed over to Navia, announcing proudly that her illness had been cured. A flicker of something dark crossed Navia's eyes for just an instant, before switching seamlessly into an expression of delighted surprise. Vivian assumed she had simply imagined it, and smiled brightly, thinking that since her illness had now been cured, that meant Navia had become entirely useless. Navia began sowing chaos throughout the Duke's estate in order to make her escape as smooth as possible. First was Vivian herself, the Duke's true daughter, who, having just recovered from her illness, ran into Navia in the hallway. The nanny had once told Vivian that Navia was nothing but a fraud brought in to replace her, someone who could never truly belong among the nobility. Yet in her heart, Vivian had always assumed everyone genuinely adored Navia. Even her brother had risked his own life to save her during his recent magic overload, when the last time, he had wished her dead outright. And yet they were true siblings by blood, she and her brother. Now that Vivian had recovered, everything felt different. She clasped her small hands together and asked Navia, now that her illness was cured, did that mean Navia no longer needed to marry the prince in her place? Before Navia could respond, the blonde maid jumped in eagerly. Of course, Vivian is the true daughter of this house, so naturally she should exercise the rights that belong to her. She then deliberately asked Navia if she agreed, expecting Navia to lash out in anger and say something improper. But Navia simply smiled and agreed without hesitation, saying she had merely been Vivian's stand-in all along, brought here for that very purpose. The blonde maid felt an odd twinge of unease at how docile Navia's response had been. The next moment, Navia continued, but I do intend to personally handle the matter concerning the nanny. Vivian looked utterly puzzled, having no idea what had happened to the nanny at all. The blonde maid felt a knot forming in her stomach, unsure what Navia intended to do about the situation. In response to Vivian's questions, Navia explained, I heard today that the nanny has been thrown into prison, but she has looked after us all this time. How can we simply stand by and let her be executed? Only then did Vivian learn what had happened to the nanny, and she gasped in alarm, insisting the nanny mustn't be killed. Navia agreed that she felt exactly the same way and said she intended to go rescue the nanny herself. Vivian declared that only she, as the true daughter of the house, could possibly accomplish something like this. The blonde maid sensed things were about to take a turn for the worse, and quickly reminded Vivian that only the Duke himself had the authority to decide the nanny's fate, and no one else was permitted to interfere. Navia agreed the maid was right, suggesting perhaps it would be best for Vivian to bring the matter to their father herself. Vivian frowned, feeling that something wasn't quite adding up. She became convinced that Navia was simply looking for another opportunity to steal their father's attention away from her, just as she'd already taken her brother. Navia continued playing the part, appearing hesitant and guilt-ridden, insisting that as the elder sister, it was only right that she step forward to handle this herself. This only confirmed Vivian's suspicions further, and she declared with crossed arms that this matter absolutely had to be handled by her. Navia pleaded earnestly, insisting this wasn't such a simple matter to resolve. But the more Navia tried to discourage her, the more convinced Vivian became that if she could handle this perfectly on her own, it would prove once and for all that Navia truly had nothing left to offer. Watching Navia grow visibly more anxious only reinforced her certainty that she was right. Clenching her fists, Vivian declared loudly, "I am the true daughter of this house. Something like this should be effortless for me." With that, ignoring both Navia's and the maid's attempts to stop her, she turned and dashed off toward the prison, not forgetting to instruct the blonde maid to hold Navia back and keep her from interfering. Navia had made her final arrangements before escaping the Duke's estate. She had deliberately provoked Vivian into getting involved with the matter of the nanny's imprisonment. Watching Vivian and her maid hurry off, Navia turned and made her way to the laundry room, but found no sign of Charlotte there. After asking around, she learned that Charlotte had been assigned to do the heavy labor inside. As she walked further in, Navia reflected that all her earlier efforts to win Charlotte over had been leading up to exactly this moment. Spotting the familiar figure, Navia called out her name softly. Charlotte turned around, her face and clothes covered in grime, and the two finally came face to face again. Charlotte explained that she had failed to heed Navia's instructions and had exposed the nanny prematurely, which was why she'd been sent to the laundry room, though fortunately she hadn't been executed for it. Everything had happened so suddenly that she hadn't had a chance to apologize to Navia before being reassigned here, and she had felt terribly guilty ever since. She lowered her head and offered a sincere, heartfelt apology. Navia hadn't expected Charlotte to apologize to her at all, since she genuinely hadn't done anything wrong. Charlotte urged Navia to leave quickly, warning that people might start gossiping if she stayed here too long. A wave of warmth rose in Navia's chest, but she reminded herself that she didn't want anything from this estate. Nor did she intend to grow close to anyone here, not even Charlotte, since she herself had no idea where her own future would lead. Navia turned and kicked over a bucket of water. She told Charlotte to stop doing this kind of backbreaking work, that the people here were clearly just bullying her. She continued, "You can't spend your whole life as a servant here. That's why I'm going to void your lifelong contract." Charlotte froze, not understanding what Navia meant. Navia had already thought it all through. She would sell off all the gifts she'd received and give Charlotte the money to pay off her contract penalty, with whatever remained left over for Charlotte to use however she wished. She said it should be considered a reward for their brief but valuable alliance. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, her fingers intertwined, her whole body trembling as she looked at Navia. Navia crossed her arms and told Charlotte not to thank her, since there was still one final task she needed her help with. Charlotte wiped away her tears, composed herself and bowed respectfully. "What would you like me to do?" Navia was planning her departure from the Duke's estate and instructed Charlotte to carry out one final task. Meanwhile, in another part of the estate, Wood was trying to piece together what had happened during his magic overload, his memory only reaching as far as grabbing Navia by the collar, everything after that a complete blank. All he knew was that he had nearly died from the overload, while Navia had walked away completely unscathed, and that was a humiliation he simply couldn't swallow. Just then, a maid announced that Charlotte was requesting an audience. Wood frowned, knowing Charlotte was Navia's former personal maid, wondering why on earth she would come looking for him, sensing something suspicious about the whole situation. A moment later, Charlotte bowed respectfully before him, thanking him for agreeing to see her. Wood, seated on the sofa, asked bluntly what she wanted. Charlotte hesitated, stammering that it concerned Lady Navia. Lady Navia is actually a commoner. The revelation hit Wood like a thunderclap, and he shot up from the sofa in shock, demanding to know if this was really true. Charlotte explained that the Duke had kept it hidden all this time, fearing it would jeopardize her engagement to the prince if word got out. Wood ground his teeth in fury. He had at least assumed Navia was some lesser noble, but to think such a lowly commoner had dared to treat him with such disrespect, even nearly getting him killed, he wanted nothing more than to tear her apart. Charlotte continued, saying this wasn't even the most important part. "I've heard that before long, Lady Navia will be sent to become the Reed family's adopted daughter. If she becomes their heir, her status would rise to match your own, young master, and it seems the Duke is even planning to have the two of you married eventually." Hearing this, Wood trembled with fury, unable to believe that his father would actually want him to marry a commoner. Charlotte suggested he could wait until the Duke returned and confirm this directly with him. Wood fell into a brooding silence, and Charlotte added fuel to the fire, suggesting that once the Duke returned, Lady Navia would likely be sent off to the Reed family almost immediately, making a marriage between Wood and Navia all but certain. Wood simply couldn't understand why his father would do this to him. Sensing the moment was right, Charlotte's lips curved into a smile. "I do happen to have a good idea." But before she could explain further, the nanny suddenly burst into the room, shouting, "Young master, please help me, I've been wrongfully accused." Charlotte was in the middle of carrying out Navia's final instructions when the nanny suddenly escaped from prison, coming to Wood to plead her case, only to unexpectedly run into Charlotte already in conversation with him. Charlotte asked disdainfully how she dared barge into the young master's room uninvited. The nanny trembled with rage, having fallen to her current wretched state entirely because of Charlotte, the true source of all her misfortune. She lunged forward in a fit of fury and grabbed a fistful of Charlotte's hair, screaming that she was nothing but a curse upon everyone around her. The next instant, a burst of water magic struck the nanny squarely in the back. Wood, clearly displeased by her unhinged behavior, snapped, "Criminals should stay in prison and reflect on their wrongdoing. What are you doing causing a scene here?" The nanny shrank back against the wall, cowering in fear, horrified to realize that Wood was now looking at her with the exact same contempt he'd once reserved for that lowly girl Navia. She wailed and pleaded that the young master couldn't possibly treat her this way, not after everything she'd done to care for him over the years. Wood, thoroughly irritated, demanded to know how she had even managed to escape prison in the first place, suspecting his foolish sister might have had something to do with it. Just then, the guards finally arrived, and Wood ordered them to lock the nanny back up, instructing them not to release her no matter what Vivian might say. The door slammed shut with a thud as the guards dragged the nanny away. Once the room fell quiet again, Wood asked Charlotte to continue explaining what she had been about to propose. Elsewhere, Navia handed over the expensive clothing she had received to the butler, asking him to sell it all off for her. When the butler asked why, Navia answered somewhat bashfully, explaining that since today marked Vivian's full recovery, she wanted to buy small gifts for the family to celebrate everyone's health and happiness. Hearing this, the butler had no reason to refuse and agreed to her request. A short while later, back in Navia's room, Charlotte reported that she had relayed every word Navia had coached her to say to Wood. Navia turned and pulled out a small money pouch, the proceeds from selling off her gifts, and handed the entire sum to Charlotte, telling her to leave the estate that very day and go start a new life wherever she wished. She then urged Charlotte to leave right away. Charlotte's heart swelled with gratitude. She bowed deeply to Navia. "My lady, thank you." After Charlotte left, Navia stood alone by the window. Outside, the rain continued to fall. She noticed her sleeves had grown a little short. This dress was still from last year, after all. She turned to survey her room one last time, thinking how, only in this final rebirth, had she finally earned the right to live in a room reserved exclusively for the Duke's own children. Perhaps this was the kind of place every young girl dreamed of living in, but now she found the place utterly repulsive. With everything finally in place, it was time for Navia to leave this house for good. She pushed open the door and strode out with determined steps. This time, if she failed, there would be no second chances, only death. This girl had lived through 8 rebirths, all in pursuit of her family's love, only to receive nothing but unfair treatment from everyone around her in return. In this final rebirth, having made every preparation to escape the Duke's estate, Navia walked out of her room according to plan, only to hear a heated argument erupting downstairs. It turned out that Vivian was demanding the butler release the nanny. The butler insisted repeatedly that young Master Wood had ordered the nanny locked back up, and that with the Duke away, everyone should be following the instructions of Wood, the rightful heir to the estate. Sensing the situation wasn't going her way, the nanny pointed at the butler and demanded to know whether he realized Lady Vivian would one day become queen, and whether he could bear the consequences of showing such disrespect toward the future royal family. Hearing this threat, the butler faltered, at a loss for what to do. Navia descended the staircase with elegant composure and asked the nanny, "Is that true? Will Vivian really become queen?" Seeing Navia approach, Vivian sensed trouble immediately, certain Navia had come to obstruct her plans. The nanny answered haughtily that of course Vivian would become queen, it was only natural, and added that Navia's entire presence in this household had only ever been to serve as Vivian's stand-in. Her words reminded the maids once again of Navia's true status, reinforcing their belief that Navia now held no value whatsoever. Navia remained entirely unaffected. She placed a sincere hand over her heart and said she was truly delighted that Vivian would become queen, but then added, "Still, hasn't that not happened yet?" Navia rested her chin thoughtfully and gave a soft chuckle, saying she supposed she'd simply worried over nothing. But regardless, speaking so carelessly about the royal family could have very serious consequences. Her words struck a chord with the butler standing nearby, reminding him that recklessly speculating about who might become the next queen could easily be considered a punishable offense. Vivian bit down on her lip in anger and shouted at Navia, "You're clearly just jealous that I'll become the next queen. I know exactly what you're doing." The butler's heart lurched in alarm. He absolutely could not allow Vivian to keep saying such things in front of him, or the Duke would show him no mercy. He snapped at the nanny for inciting Vivian to say things she shouldn't, declaring he would no longer tolerate anyone's interference, and ordering the guards to take the nanny back to prison. The nanny continued to protest stubbornly, insisting Navia had slandered her. That wretched girl wants to turn this entire estate upside down. As the nanny was dragged away, Navia silently mouthed to her, "You're not wrong about that." But the nanny never got the chance to witness the rest of the show that was about to unfold. Navia was on the verge of leaving the Duke's estate for good. Before departing, she had used the butler to have the nanny thrown back into prison. An act so ruthless, it left even Vivian in tears, declaring she would tell their father everything, insisting her sister was simply terrifying. The maids rushed to comfort her, offering to bring her some sweets to enjoy while they waited for the Duke's return. The blonde maid deliberately bumped into Navia as she stood up, noticing that Navia appeared dressed and ready to go out, and asked pointedly, "Are you planning to leave, Lady Navia?" The butler, too, seemed to sense Navia's intentions and asked where she was headed. Navia explained rather awkwardly that she had mentioned earlier wanting to buy gifts for the family. The butler felt a flash of irritation, wondering why she'd choose to go out in such heavy rain. But on second thought, given Vivian's current state, it might actually be for the best if Navia left the estate for a while. So he agreed to arrange a carriage for her. Moments later, a maid approached Navia to inform her that the carriage was already prepared. "You can leave right away." Watching the maid's unnatural expression, Navia immediately recognized the lie, since she hadn't even mentioned wanting to go out until moments ago, so there was no way a carriage could have been arranged so quickly. Still, this was exactly the step she needed for her plan to work. Feigning calm composure, Navia turned toward the door. "All right then, let's go." Seeing that Navia suspected nothing, the maid secretly let out a sigh of relief. A short while later, Navia stepped outside and, upon seeing the so-called carriage waiting for her, immediately spotted several glaring inconsistencies. The carriage was parked in an oddly secluded spot, bore no markings identifying it as belonging to the Duke's estate, and the driver was a complete stranger to her. Strangest of all, there was another person sitting beside the driver. Playing dumb, Navia hurried forward and grabbed the stranger's arm, asking with feigned curiosity, "Who is this? Why are you covering your face?" The mysterious figure yanked his arm away from her grip. The driver apologized awkwardly, explaining that this was his assistant, who had simply been too struck by Lady Navia's beauty and reacted a bit strangely. Navia laughed it off easily, saying it was no trouble at all, though in truth she had already known all along that this figure was none other than Wood himself. Through that brief physical contact just now, the black moon on her hand had already absorbed his magic. The maid urged Navia to board the carriage quickly since the rain was coming down hard. Wood quietly glanced at Navia, sneering inwardly at the thought of some filthy commoner daring to touch him with her dirty hands. And so, Navia climbed aboard this carriage laden with conspiracy, fully aware it was heading in the opposite direction from the bustling city streets, toward an area surrounded by lakes and forests, the perfect setting for whatever dark scheme was about to unfold. Of course, all of this remained entirely within Navia's own plan, since this very road also happened to lead toward the Reed family's territory. Navia had boarded the carriage heading toward Duke Reed's estate, and every bit of this was unfolding exactly as she had planned. Earlier, she had sent Charlotte to plant an idea in Wood's mind, suggesting he turn Navia into his own slave. Wood had crossed his arms, pointing out that slavery was strictly forbidden within the Empire, but Charlotte assured him she had a way to make it happen. Once Navia set out, Wood could hire assassins to ride along in the carriage with her, and when they passed near Duke Reed's estate, have the assassins stage an attack against the Reed family. Wood caught on immediately. If a commoner ever harmed a noble, that person would be instantly reduced to slavery, since imperial law was especially harsh toward commoners. All he needed to do was step forward at the right moment and expose Navia's true status as a commoner, and he could bypass the formal slave trial altogether, turning her directly into his own personal slave. Riding along in the swaying carriage, Navia reflected on the details Charlotte had relayed from her conversation with Wood. There was one crucial detail Wood surely didn't realize. If the noble who'd supposedly been attacked claimed he hadn't actually been harmed, then no trial would take place at all. Navia mused to herself that hiring assassins to attack the Reed family was hardly something a clear-thinking person would attempt. But Wood was simple-minded and consumed with hatred for her, so he likely felt quite confident about the plan. What's more, with the rain pouring down outside, water magic would be at its most powerful, which, conveniently, worked equally in Navia's favor, since she could steal Wood's magic for herself. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. Navia studied her own delicate hands, admitting to herself that she wasn't entirely confident either. There was no telling whether Duke Reed would even listen to a complete stranger like her, or whether he might simply take one look at her and decide to have her killed on the spot. Still, she'd already worked out exactly how she would try to persuade him. She simply needed to make the Duke understand the benefits of taking her in, and that alone would be enough to secure her survival. Just then, the carriage rattled to a stop. Listening to the rustling sounds outside, Navia knew the assassins had arrived. Outside the carriage, the assassins who had already been lying in wait approached Wood, demanding the remaining payment for the job. Wood produced a bag of gold coins and promised an additional tip once the deed was done. The assassins chuckled, remarking that they'd need to work extra hard for that kind of bonus, as they gradually closed in on the carriage. The next instant, a surge of magical current burst from within the carriage, and a powerful blast of water magic shattered it instantly. Navia had unleashed the magic she'd stolen from Wood, catching the assassins completely off guard, and she burst out from the wreckage of the carriage, taking advantage of the chaos to sprint headlong into the depths of the forest. Navia was about to reunite with her true family at last. Using the magic she had absorbed from Wood's body, she caught the assassins off guard and fled toward Duke Reed's estate. Seeing her escape, Wood shouted furiously for the assassins to catch her immediately. Just then, a burst of explosive fire magic shot toward Navia from behind. She barely dodged it in time, only to realize with alarm that there was a mage among the assassins as well, which drastically reduced her chances of surviving this. Gritting her teeth, Navia resolved that even if this meant death, she would rather die right at Duke Reed's doorstep. She pushed her legs forward, continuing to run, since only that way could she ensure Wood would be caught red-handed. The next instant, a violent explosion erupted right behind Navia, sending her flying through the air on a wave of fire before she crashed hard onto the ground. Her exhausted body could barely find the strength to rise again. She clenched her fists, thinking of how hard she had fought to make it this far, refusing to let herself die now no matter what. Navia summoned every last ounce of strength to push herself up, rain mixing with tears as they streamed down her young face. Then, with a sudden thud, a figure appeared before her. It was Wood, gasping for breath, having caught up to her at last, his face twisted with loathing. He no longer cared about turning her into a slave now. All he wanted was to kill her outright. Just as he began gathering his magic, one of the assassins interrupted him. The man in the hooded cloak grabbed Wood by the collar, demanding to know why he hadn't told them this girl was a mage, since they had nearly failed because of it. Wood struggled against the assassin's grip, snapping at him for daring to treat him so disrespectfully. But these assassins were hardened criminals who cared nothing for his noble status. And this was, after all, the remote, unpopulated territory surrounding Duke Reed's estate, meaning even if they killed Wood outright, no one would ever find out. A wave of genuine panic finally hit him, and he began pleading that he was the heir to his family, that he had more than enough money, and that once this job was done, he could give them enough to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Persuaded by this promise, the assassin released Wood and slowly advanced toward Navia. Without hesitation, he seized her, intending to finish her off right then and there. As explosive magic gathered in his palm, Navia seized the opportunity and grabbed his wrist. The assassin immediately felt his gathered magic rapidly draining away, and a triumphant smile spread across Navia's face as she used the black moon once again to absorb his power. The next instant, a massive explosion tore through the forest. and the force of the blast sent Navia soaring into the air. As she felt herself falling, she wondered if this was finally it. Whether she would simply die from the fall, having already given everything she had this time. Still, dying right at Duke Reed's doorstep, leaving a permanent stain on the Wood family's reputation, would at least mean she hadn't died for nothing. Just as Navia expected the impact of hitting the ground, it never came. Instead, she felt her body enveloped in something soft and cushioning, and a low, distant voice spoke beside her ear. What a strange and wondrous world this truly is. Navia opened her eyes to find a man with long, flowing hair holding her in his arms. She sensed an intense yet distant, cool presence radiating from him, and realized this was the first time she had ever laid eyes on his face. After enduring untold hardships, Navia had finally come face to face with Duke Reed. He held her in his arms and said something that struck her as deeply strange. "This is the first time I've ever seen this face." Navia couldn't quite understand what he meant. They had obviously never met before. That much was plainly true. Though she had so much she wanted to say to Duke Reed in that moment, she no longer had the strength left to speak. The feeling overtaking her now was all too familiar, the unmistakable approach of death. She had faced death before, more than once, poor girl that she was. And this time, all that mattered was that she had managed to deal a real blow to Wood's family. With that thought lingering in her mind, sheer will to survive drove Navia to lift her small hand with the last of her strength, gripping tightly onto Duke Reed's collar. "Please, save me." With those words spoken, she sank completely into darkness. Navia had no idea how much time had passed when she woke up. The dark, oppressive surroundings made her think for a moment that she had actually died, wondering if she'd simply been reborn back to the very beginning again. But then she remembered. She'd already used up every last one of her rebirths. Slowly, she began to feel sensation returning to her fingers, gradually regaining control over her body, and she opened her eyes with a jolt. She was lying flat on a large bed. She had survived after all. Navia struggled to sit up, taking in the black bed sheets beneath her and the dark furnishings and decor surrounding her. A place that could only belong to Duke Reed's estate. She recalled the man with red eyes who had held her in his arms. Could that have truly been Duke Reed himself? Remembering how she had begged for her life with her eyes squeezed shut, Navia suddenly felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. She had already been changed into fine sleeping garments, similar to what Vivian used to wear, and despite being covered head to toe in injuries, she felt no pain whatsoever. It seemed the Duke had used some kind of numbing herb on her. Duke Reed's cousin, Count Alban, ran a factory that produced exactly this kind of numbing herb, though it was extraordinarily expensive, considered a rare commodity even among the empire's nobility. Navia rested her chin in thought, reflecting that there was no such thing as kindness without a motive in this world, and she hoped Duke Reed had saved her because he saw some value in keeping her alive. That way, she could negotiate with him properly and secure her place here. Navia got out of bed and tried to walk around. She had no time to rest. She needed to get word out about the attack on Duke Reed's estate before Wood could twist the narrative in his own favor. Right now, the most important thing was finding Duke Reed and coming to some kind of understanding with him. Just then, her stomach growled embarrassingly loud. She walked over to the table, hoping to find some water to tide her over, only to discover, to her surprise, medicine, drinking water, and biscuits already laid out for her. A warm feeling rose in Navia's chest, though she quickly reminded herself there was nothing particularly remarkable about this. After eating a few biscuits, Navia decided she couldn't afford to delay any longer. She needed to find Duke Reed right away. Just then, a sharp voice rang out from the living room. He actually took the very enemy who attacked this estate and gave her such a fine room, even having her wounds tended to. Navia had finally made it into Duke Reed's estate, though she still wasn't entirely certain the man who had saved her was actually Duke Reed himself. Just as she was preparing to seek him out and discuss the matter of her adoption, a jarring voice interrupted her plans. A man strode into her room with heavy, deliberate steps, clearly furious that Navia had been allowed to recover here in such comfortable quarters. He'd only been away for a short while, and already such a huge mess had unfolded. Navia looked at this man with his hair slicked back and recognized him immediately as Duke Reed's cousin, Count Alban, who currently served as acting head of the estate. From her memories of past lives, she knew this man had no regard for etiquette or propriety, and cared only about money and power, shallow to his very core. Still, having just arrived here, Navia had no wish to make enemies with anyone, so she greeted him politely. Only then did the man finally look up and notice her. Upon hearing Navia's name and connecting it to Wood's recent attack on the Reed estate, Albin immediately made the connection. This was indeed the adopted daughter of House Agnes. Her beauty truly lived up to its reputation, and given a few more years, she would undoubtedly grow into an unrivaled beauty. Albin's lips curled into a satisfied smirk, thinking how fortunate he was. The very girl who had been competing with his own daughter for the position of future queen had practically delivered herself right into his hands. He ignored Navia entirely at first, waving his hand dismissively and criticizing her for only now getting dressed and out of bed, remarking that she clearly lacked proper upbringing. The next moment, he wasted no time condemning her outright, declaring that she was undoubtedly the one who had orchestrated the attack on the estate. He added scornfully that Reed was even more incompetent than he'd thought, allowing the very person who had attacked them to stay right here in his own home. From Albin's tone, Navia could tell this man held Duke Reed in fairly low regard. Though in her own impression, Duke Reed hardly seemed like an incompetent man at all. In fact, he was powerful enough to destroy anyone who crossed him. Which meant Duke Reed must be deliberately allowing Albin to hold this much power, letting him run rampant throughout the estate as he pleased. Albin had no interest in wasting further words with Navia and declared he would have her thrown into prison immediately. He moved to grab her without warning, catching Navia completely off guard, and she could only insist that Duke Reed himself had brought her here. The man sneered, clearly holding no regard for Duke Reed whatsoever, remarking that even if Navia died, Reed wouldn't so much as blink. Severely wounded, Navia had no strength left to resist against a grown man's grip, and it seemed she was about to be dragged away. Just then, an intense, cool presence swept through the entire room. Navia recognized it immediately, the exact same sensation she had felt when she was rescued earlier. The next instant, a large hand clamped down firmly on Albin's wrist. He spun around, ready to demand who dared to touch him with such audacity, only to find Duke Reed standing behind him, rubbing his sleepy eyes as though he had just woken up. Navia's nerves suddenly spiked with tension. This was the very man who had saved her before she'd lost consciousness, and now she could confirm it beyond doubt. This man with long black hair and piercing crimson eyes was indeed the Duke Reed she had been searching for. Once again, Duke Reed had come to Navia's rescue. As acting head of the household, Count Albin had attempted to have Navia thrown into prison, only to be stopped by Duke Reed's sudden appearance. Recognizing who had arrived, Albin forced back his anger and remarked, "You're up rather early today, aren't you?" Duke Reed's brow furrowed slightly, his hand still gripping the Count's wrist like an iron vice. "Because someone disturbed my peaceful sleep." Albin harbored deep disdain for Reed, viewing him as nothing more than a pathetic invalid kept alive by medicine who dared act so brazenly simply because he could use magic. If it weren't for himself, Reed would have had no way of acquiring such a large supply of numbing herbs at such a low price. Emboldened by this leverage, Albin pressed the matter of Navia further, pointing out that Reed clearly knew she was the one responsible for attacking the estate, and yet was allowing her to recover here under his own roof. If word of this ever got out, wouldn't their entire family become a laughingstock? Hearing Albin's vile accusations, Navia found herself laughing rather than angry. Though she had already escaped House Agnes, she knew perfectly well that the outside world was full of people just like him, people just like this Count Albin. Still, Navia understood with absolute clarity that Albin was nowhere near her match. With that thought in mind, Navia adopted a pitiful, helpless expression, her voice taking on a note of fragility. "Count Albin, am I causing you a great deal of trouble by being here?" Albin snapped irritably that she was talking nonsense. Navia feigned confusion, asking why, as acting head of the household, he would treat Duke Reed with such blatant disrespect, pointing out that if word of this got out, it could seriously damage the standing of every noble family involved. Albin was no fool. He understood perfectly well just how much scandal it would cause if word got out that the acting head of a household had overstepped his authority so brazenly, but what concerned him more was that this insolent girl actually dared to use this very fact as leverage against him. Enraged, Albin ordered the guards to execute Navia on the spot and send her body back to House Agnes. Duke Reed, who had remained silent throughout, finally spoke, his voice cold and sharp as ice. I already told you once you're being too loud. Do you intend to keep testing my limits? Albin hadn't heard Reed speak in this tone in a very long time. Recalling what Navia had just said, he swallowed his anger and admitted it would probably be better to let Reed handle the matter himself. Duke Reed leaned in close to Albin's ear. Get out of my house right now. Albin clenched his fist so tightly his knuckles nearly cracked, but all he could do was grit his teeth and agree to leave immediately. Watching the Count scurry away, Navia understood clearly that dealing with someone who couldn't hide his true feelings was actually quite simple. It was the people who never let their emotions show that were truly difficult to handle. Once the Count had left, Navia formally introduced herself to Duke Reed. Thank you for helping me. I'm Navia, the adopted daughter of House Agnes. Reed's reaction mirrored the one he'd given the day he'd rescued her, uttering a statement that left Navia utterly baffled. This is the first time I've ever heard that name. This marked Navia's first formal conversation with Duke Reed. When he claimed this was the first time he'd ever heard her name, the response struck Navia as strange, almost as if there existed no one in this world he didn't already know. Regardless, she finally had a real chance to speak with Duke Reed, and she was determined to make the most of it. Navia put on an apologetic expression and said she had caused the Duke a great deal of trouble, that if he hadn't come to her rescue, she would have died at her brother Wood's hands, since he had likely hired the assassin specifically to kill her. Before she could finish, Duke Reed cut her off impatiently. That's enough. Stop putting on this act in front of me. Navia froze for a moment, wondering if Duke Reed had somehow seen through her scheme entirely. Yet her composed demeanor only reinforced his suspicion that she was lying, since any ordinary child scolded like this would surely burst into tears or turn pale with fright. Navia, on the other hand, simply let a hint of cunning cross her lips. Very well, I'll be direct then. She explained that her brother Wood, in his attempt to turn her into his slave, had hired assassins to stage an attack against Duke Reed's estate, but the plan had now failed. Her adoptive father would surely make her the scapegoat to resolve this mess, offering Duke Reed a substantial sum in compensation. If Duke Reed agreed to deal with Navia himself and accept the payment, the entire matter could be settled smoothly. Navia then shifted the conversation, and this was the real point she wanted to make. She knew Duke Reed's estate maintained a knight's order, and covering their daily expenses had always been a persistent burden for the Reed family. So she had a proposal. Placing a hand gently over her heart, she said with genuine sincerity, "You might consider adopting me instead." Reed opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He pressed a hand to his forehead and let out a deep sigh. "I thought you were going to say something interesting. How utterly absurd." This little girl had appeared out of nowhere, gone on and on about needing to be saved, and now she was suddenly asking him to adopt her. The Duke glanced at Navia, reflecting that the only reason he'd saved her in the first place was because of her hair. It was Navia's beautiful silver hair that had compelled him to spare her life, intending simply to send her on her way afterward. From the exchange he'd just witnessed between Navia and Albin, it was clear that this little girl, who appeared to be only a few years old, was not only remarkably cunning but also deeply versed in the ways of the world. Reed now realized he'd brought home quite a handful. He asked Navia why exactly he should adopt her. This was precisely Navia's leverage, because doing so would earn you money. Reed tapped his fingers against his arm, clearly unmoved by her words. "And what makes you think you're worth that?" Navia had already thought this through carefully. The Reed family possessed advanced knowledge of magical theory, yet the Duke had no children of his own even now, and likely had no intention of ever having any. If the Duke kept her by his side, the Reed family would gain an heir capable of forging valuable marriage alliances. This would make both the magic-hungry royal family and the wealthy House Agnes eager to extend an olive branch to the Reed family. And compared to these benefits, that small compensation payment would be utterly insignificant. Reed remained silent after hearing this out, clearly unmoved by any of her arguments. Having no further interest in continuing the conversation, he turned to leave. Just then, Navia called out to stop him once more. "There's more. I can also help you get rid of Count Albin." Navia pulled out every trick she had to secure her place at Duke Reed's estate, even offering to help him eliminate the troublesome Count Albin. Reed paused mid-step and asked her what plan she had in mind. Navia felt as though she'd finally grasped a lifeline, yet she wasn't willing to reveal her method just yet. This was her trump card to keep in reserve. Duke Reed let out a cold laugh. "You really are quite the audacious child. Navia responded that she had no intention of overstaying her welcome indefinitely. Once she reached the legal age of adulthood, she would gladly become independent from this family entirely. The Duke slowly turned and walked closer to Navia. Lowering his head, his tone remaining utterly flat, he said, "I despise people like you, so calculating. Being betrayed by someone like you would be more trouble than it's worth." He reached out and gently lifted a strand of her hair. "And someone with hair like yours would be even more trouble." Navia felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. People like Reed, who held the power of life and death over others, tended to look at someone as lowly as her with that particular kind of cold, dismissive gaze. What was she supposed to do now? Just in case, Navia decided to test Reed's magic using the Black Moon first. She pretended to ask him to let go of her hair, and in doing so, deliberately brushed against his wrist. The next instant, two pairs of startled eyes met each other. Navia discovered that the Black Moon had absolutely no effect on Reed whatsoever, and the Duke, in turn, demanded to know in shock what she had just done to him. Before he could press further, Navia quickly regained her composure, saying that if the Duke didn't like her hair, she could cut it all off, or even dye it a different color entirely. She dropped to the floor and began to sob. "I'll behave. Whatever you ask of me, I'll do it." Navia still viewed Reed through the same lens as those high and mighty nobles she'd known before, people who loved hearing this kind of submissive plea, and in truth, she genuinely meant it, since Duke Reed was her only remaining chance to change her fate. Even if it meant humbling herself completely, she had no complaints to make. All Navia wanted truly was to survive. The room fell into silence once more. Duke Reed stood off to the side, his expression as unreadable as ever, giving no hint of what he was actually thinking. Navia felt herself sinking slowly into despair. In the end, she was still being shunned simply for her lowly birth. No matter where she went, she never seemed to be welcome, and even when she worked hard to prove her own worth, she still couldn't earn any real respect. Duke Reed clearly despised her calculating nature. What exactly could she possibly do now to survive? After a long pause, the Duke finally spoke. "I won't kill you. You can go." Duke Reed had no intention of taking Navia in, even after she had laid out every possible benefit of adopting her as his ward. Yet the Duke remained as unmoving and cold as 3 mountains of ice. With that path closed off, only one option remained. Navia recalled from her past life memories that Duke Reed's one true weakness was his territory itself. "Your Grace, you've dedicated yourself to protecting this land, haven't you?" The Duke's posture stiffened slightly. Navia continued, explaining that as House Agnes's adopted daughter, she understood all too well just how arrogant and stubborn that family truly was, and that they had long coveted this very territory. Reed's emotions flickered with a rare intensity as he told her to be quiet, but Navia refused to relent. She insisted that even if the Duke got rid of her, it wouldn't solve anything, since that family would continue coveting this land regardless, and even their descendants would eventually come seeking it out. The Duke's anger flared. "I told you to be quiet. Didn't you hear me?" But Navia only grew more animated, pointing out that if Duke Reed ever took in another adopted son or daughter instead, she would lose this opportunity entirely, and he would surely come to regret not keeping her by his side when he had the chance. Reed gritted his teeth in fury, yet inside his mind was in absolute turmoil, because Navia had somehow managed to see right through him. His gaze sharpened, his tone turning cold and menacing. "It seems you don't value your life very much." Of course Navia valued her life. It was precisely because she valued it so deeply that she was willing to threaten Duke Reed like this. The Duke let out a long, heavy breath. This girl truly rubbed him the wrong way, whether it was that shimmering silver hair of hers or this desperate, unrelenting will to survive. All of it left him deeply unsettled. He slowly raised his hand, thinking that if this was how things stood, it might be simpler to just make her disappear entirely. Yet Reed couldn't bring himself to do it, because Navia felt like a single ray of light breaking through the darkness of this estate, and that head of silver hair was identical to someone buried deep within his memory. The Duke let out a low grunt, as though he had just come to some significant decision, and the magic gathering in his hand dissolved with a soft crackle. Navia jumped, startled, and before she could fully process what was happening, she heard Reed say, "You cannot stay here permanently. You must leave within 1 year." With that, he turned to walk away. Navia pressed further, asking if that meant she was free to live here for the next full year. The Duke replied irritably that she could do as she pleased, then snapped his fingers and simply vanished into thin air, leaving Navia standing there utterly bewildered. She couldn't quite understand what kind of power Duke Reed actually possessed. He was clearly a mage, and yet the Black Moon hadn't reacted to him at all when she touched him. And on top of that, he could apparently use some form of teleportation magic as well. For the moment, Navia simply couldn't make sense of any of it. Still, Duke Reed had finally accepted her, at least in some capacity. Though she could only stay for a year, she would at least be safe here for the time being. What happened after that would depend entirely on how House Agnes and the royal family chose to handle the situation. Just then, a bespectacled girl peeked her head cautiously around the corner, sneaking glances at Navia. Distracted, she accidentally dropped everything she was carrying onto the floor. Navia rushed over to help, but the girl had already gathered everything up herself. Telling Navia there was no need to be so polite, she was simply the master's personal physician. Duke Reed had agreed to let Navia stay and had instructed his physician to treat her injuries. The physician was a timid girl who reminded Navia of a hamster, and by comparison, Navia herself seemed considerably more composed and mature. Still, the fact that Duke Reed kept a personal physician on staff made Navia wonder whether the Duke might be suffering from some health condition that kept him confined indoors. The physician was clearly quite shy, and in response to Navia's polite introduction, she could only stammer, unable to find the right words. Navia asked if she was the one who had come to treat her, and the girl simply nodded before patiently beginning to change Navia's bandages. Curious, Navia asked whether this same young woman had been the one treating her earlier as well. The physician answered nervously that yes, it had been her. "Thank you," Navia said, her gratitude genuine, since this was truly the first time anyone had ever taken such patient, dedicated care of her wounds. Hearing this, the physician blushed and murmured quietly, "You're too kind. It's simply my duty." For the first time since arriving at the Duke's estate, Navia allowed herself a genuine smile. "Then I'll be counting on you from now on." The physician's face flushed even redder. Clearly not very skilled at social interaction, she finished tending to Navia's wounds and hurried out of the room. Exhausted, Navia collapsed onto the bed, completely drained, since she hadn't eaten a single thing all day. Elsewhere, in Reed's own chambers, the Duke summoned his aide, Lastman, instructing him to arrange Navia's living situation according to his wishes. Lastman's brow furrowed with concern, suggesting it might be better to simply send Navia back along with Wood. After all, she was still the adopted daughter of House Agnes, and there seemed to be a great many suspicious circumstances surrounding her. Keeping a child like this within the estate seemed genuinely unwise. Duke Reed's gaze turned cold. "I've already agreed to let her stay here for a year. Do I really need to repeat myself?" Sensing the Duke's displeasure, Lastman said nothing more, bowed respectfully, and went off to carry out his orders. Outside the window, delicate, glistening snowflakes began drifting down. The Duke murmured to himself, "Has the rain turned to snow? How strange." He made his way back toward his own chambers, reflecting that in all his memory, it had never once snowed on this particular day before. Duke Reed's estate was both dark and bitterly cold, its bleak, desolate atmosphere enough to send chills down anyone's spine. A mocking smile crossed his lips. This entire mansion felt like an enormous coffin, home to an immortal being trapped in an endless cycle of rebirth, drifting through each day in a haze. As it turned out, Duke Reed, much like Navia herself, had also been caught in an unending cycle of death and rebirth. Duke Reed's estate truly was like a coffin, and within it, he had been living through an endless, lightless cycle of his own. It was no wonder that upon first seeing Navia, his immediate reaction had been that this was the first time he'd ever seen her face, and the first time he'd ever heard her name. No one knew exactly what connection existed between Duke Reed and Navia. Within the royal palace, a maid was combing the hair of a golden-haired noblewoman, the Empress of the realm. The Empress remarked wryly that her hair no longer held the same shine it once had, that she had grown old and lost her former beauty. The maid flattered her, insisting that in her eyes the Empress remained as radiant and youthful as ever. The next moment, the maid accidentally snapped off a small lock of the Empress's hair, and her face instantly drained of color. The other servants in the room froze in stunned silence, already knowing exactly what was about to happen. Before the Empress could even respond, the maid had already dropped to her knees, Your Majesty, I didn't mean to. Please forgive me. The Empress acted as though she hadn't heard a word, simply murmuring quietly to a guard, "Take her away." The room fell utterly silent except for the maid's desperate sobbing and pleading as she was dragged out. The Empress then pointed at another maid. "What are you standing there for? Come here and finish my hair." Just then, another maid arrived to report that Duke Agnes had already arrived at the palace, though he had gone first to pay his respects to the Emperor. The Empress fell into thought, recalling the betrothal arrangement she had made with Duke Agnes. She also knew that the Duke's adopted daughter, Navia, was said to be a remarkably beautiful girl, and more importantly, that Navia possessed silver-white hair and striking crimson eyes, traits that happened to align perfectly with Prince Aries' known fondness for collecting creatures with silver feathers or crimson eyes. She wondered what his reaction might be upon finally laying eyes on Navia. The Empress then asked about the condition of Duke Agnes's son, and the maid replied that Wood had already regained consciousness and appeared to be in no serious danger. The Empress's information was still limited to the earlier report that Wood had been injured from a magic overload while confronting Navia. She considered that Wood had never struck her as a particularly disciplined or sensible child. On the contrary, she found herself increasingly convinced that the Duke's adopted daughter, Navia, was likely nothing like the foolish, unremarkable girl the rumors made her out to be. With that thought in mind, the Empress decided it was time to go see the Emperor herself.